Chapter 13 of the Deerslayer. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Deerslayer, by James Fenimore Cooper. Chapter 13. An oaken, broken elbow-chair, a caudle cup without an ear, a battered, shattered ash bedstead, a box of deal without a lid, a pair of tongs, but out of joint, a back-sword poker without point, a dish which might good meat afford once, an Ovid, and an old concordance. Thomas Sheridan, a true and faithful inventory of the goods belonging to Dr. Swift. 11. Lines 1 through 6, and 13 through 14. No sooner did Deerslayer raise the pistols than he turned to the Delaware and held them up for his admiration. "Child gun," said the Serpent, smiling, while he handled one of the instruments as if it had been a toy. "Not it, Serpent, not it. 'Twas made for a man, and would satisfy a giant, if rightly used. But stop. White men are remarkable for their carelessness in putting away firearms, in chists and corners. Let me look if care has been given to these." As Deerslayer spoke, he took the weapon from the hand of his friend, and opened the pan. The last was filled with priming, caked like a bit of cinder, by time, moisture, and compression. An application of the ramrod showed that both the pistols were charged, although Judith could testify that they had probably lain for years in the chest. It is not easy to portray the surprise of the Indian at this discovery, for he was in the practice of renewing his priming daily, and of looking to the contents of his piece at other short intervals. "This is white neglect," said Deerslayer, shaking his head, "and scarce a season goes by that some one in the settlements doesn't suffer from it. It's extraordinary, too, Judith, yes, it's downright extraordinary, that the owner shall fire his piece at a deer or some other game, or perhaps at an inimy, and twice out of 3 times he'll miss. But let him catch an accident with one of these forgotten charges, and he makes it sartain death to a child, or a brother, or a friend. Well, we shall do a good turn to the owner, if we fire these pistols for him, and as they're novelties to you and me, Sarpent, we'll try our hands at a mark. Freshen that priming, and I'll do the same with this, and then we'll see who is the best man with a pistol. As for the rifle, that's long been settled atween us." Deerslayer laughed heartily at his own conceit, and in a minute or two they were both standing on the platform, selecting some object in the ark for their target. Judith was led by curiosity to their side. "Stand back, gal, stand a little back. These weapons have been long loaded," said Deerslayer, "and some accident may happen in the discharge." "Then you shall not fire them. Give them both to the Delaware, or it would be better to unload them without firing." "That's ag'in usage, and some people say ag'in manhood, though I hold to no such silly doctrine. We must fire 'em, Judith, yes, we must fire 'em, though I foresee that neither will have any great reason to boast of his skill." Judith, in the main, was a girl of great personal spirit, and her habits prevented her from feeling any of the terror that is apt to come over her sex at the report of firearms. She had discharged many a rifle, and had even been known to kill a deer under circumstances that were favorable to the effort. She submitted, therefore, falling a little back by the side of Deerslayer, giving the Indian the front of the platform to himself. Chingachgook raised the weapon several times, endeavored to steady it by using both hands, changed his attitude from one that was awkward to another still more so, and finally drew the trigger, with a sort of desperate indifference, without having, in reality, secured any aim at all. The consequence was, that instead of hitting the knot which had been selected for the mark, he missed the ark altogether, the bullet skipping along the water like a stone that was thrown by hand. "Well done, Sarpent, well done!" cried Deerslayer, laughing, with his noiseless glee. "You've hit the lake, and that's an exploit for some men. I know'd it, and as much as said it here to Judith, for your short weapons don't belong to red-skin gifts. You've hit the lake, and that's better than only hitting the air. Now stand back, and let us see what white gifts can do with a white weapon. A pistol isn't a rifle, but color is color." The aim of Deerslayer was both quick and steady, and the report followed almost as soon as the weapon rose. Still the pistol hung fire, as it is termed, and fragments of it flew in a dozen directions, some falling on the roof of the castle, others in the ark, and one in the water. Judith screamed, and when the two men turned anxiously towards the girl, she was as pale as death, trembling in every limb. "She's wounded, yes, the poor gal's wounded, Sarpent, though one couldn't foresee it, standing where she did. We'll lead her into a seat, and we must do the best for her that our knowledge and skill can afford." Judith allowed herself to be supported to a seat, swallowed a mouthful of the water that the Delaware offered her in a gourd, and, after a violent fit of trembling that seemed ready to shake her fine frame to dissolution, she burst into tears. "The pain must be borne, poor Judith, yes, it must be borne," said Deerslayer soothingly, "though I am far from wishing you not to weep, for weeping often lightens galish feelin's. Where can she be hurt, Sarpent? I see no signs of blood, nor any rent of skin or garments." "I am uninjured, Deerslayer," stammered the girl through her tears. "It's fright, nothing more, I do assure you, and God be praised, no one, I find, has been harmed by the accident." "This is extraordinary!" exclaimed the unsuspecting and simple-minded hunter. "I thought, Judith, you'd been above settlement weaknesses, and that you was a gal not to be frightened by the sound of a bursting weapon. No, I didn't think you so skeary. Hetty might well have been startled, but you've too much judgment and reason to be frightened when the danger's all over. They're pleasant to the eye, chief, and changeful, but very unsartain in their feelin's." Shame kept Judith silent. There had been no acting in her agitation, but all had fairly proceeded from sudden and uncontrollable alarm, an alarm that she found almost as inexplicable to herself as it proved to be to her companions. Wiping away the traces of tears, however, she smiled again, and was soon able to join in the laugh at her own folly. "And you, Deerslayer," she at length succeeded in saying, "are you, indeed, altogether unhurt? It seems almost miraculous that a pistol should have burst in your hand, and you escape without the loss of a limb, if not of life." "Such wonders aren't uncommon at all among worn-out arms. The first rifle they gave me played the same trick, and yet I lived through it, though not as unharmless as I've got out of this affair. Thomas Hutter is master of one pistol less than he was this morning, but as it happened in trying to sarve him, there's no ground of complaint. Now, draw near, and let us look farther into the inside of the chist." Judith by this time had so far gotten the better of her agitation as to resume her seat, and the examination went on. The next article that offered was enveloped in cloth, and on opening it, it proved to be one of the mathematical instruments that were then in use among seamen, possessing the usual ornaments and fastenings in brass. Deerslayer and Chingachgook expressed their admiration and surprise at the appearance of the unknown instrument, which was bright and glistening, having apparently been well cared for. "This goes beyond the surveyors, Judith," Deerslayer exclaimed, after turning the instrument several times in his hands. "I've seen all their tools often, and wicked and heartless enough are they, for they never come into the forest but to lead the way to waste and destruction. But none of them have as designing a look as this. I fear me, after all, that Thomas Hutter has journeyed into the wilderness with no fair intentions towards its happiness. Did you ever see any of the cravings of a surveyor about your father, gal?" "He is no surveyor, Deerslayer, nor does he know the use of that instrument, though he seems to own it. Do you suppose that Thomas Hutter ever wore that coat? It is as much too large for him, as this instrument is beyond his learning." "That's it. That must be it, Sarpent, and the old fellow, by some unknown means, has fallen heir to another man's goods. They say he has been a mariner, and no doubt this chist, and all it holds, ha! What have we here? This far outdoes the brass and black wood of the tool." Deerslayer had opened a small bag, from which he was taking, one by one, the pieces of a set of chessmen. They were of ivory, much larger than common, and exquisitely wrought. Each piece represented the character or thing after which it is named. the knights being mounted, the castles stood on elephants, and even the pawns possessed the heads and busts of men. The set was not complete, and a few fractures betrayed bad usage, but all that was left had been carefully put away and preserved. Even Judith expressed wonder, as these novel objects were placed before her eyes, and Chingachgook fairly forgot his Indian dignity in admiration and delight. The latter took up each piece, and examined it with never-tiring satisfaction, pointing out to the girl the more ingenious and striking portions of the workmanship. But the elephants gave him the greatest pleasure. The huss that he uttered, as he passed his fingers over their trunks, and ears, and tails, were very distinct. Nor did he fail to note the pawns, which were armed as archers. This exhibition lasted several minutes, during which time Judith and the Indian had all the rapture to themselves. Deerslayer sat silent, thoughtful, and even gloomy, though his eyes followed each movement of the two principal actors, noting every new peculiarity about the pieces as they were held up to view. Not an exclamation of pleasure, nor a word of condemnation passed his lips. At length his companions observed his silence, and then, for the first time since the chessmen had been discovered, did he speak. "Judith," he asked earnestly, but with a concern that amounted almost to tenderness of manner, "did your parents ever talk to you of religion?" The girl colored, and the flashes of crimson that passed over her beautiful countenance were like the wayward tints of a Neapolitan sky in November. Deerslayer had given her so strong a taste for truth, however, that she did not waver in her answer, replying simply and with sincerity. "My mother did often," she said. "My father never. I thought it made my mother sorrowful to speak of our prayers and duties. But my father has never opened his mouth on such matters, before or since her death." "That I can believe, that I can believe. He has no God. No such God as it becomes a man of white skin to worship, or even a red skin. Them things are idols." Judith started, and for a moment she seemed seriously hurt. Then she reflected, and in the end she laughed. "And you think, Deerslayer, that these ivory toys are my father's gods? I have heard of idols, and know what they are." "Them are idols," repeated the other positively. "Why should your father keep 'em, if he doesn't worship 'em?" "Would he keep his gods in a bag, and locked up in a chest? No, no, Deerslayer, my poor father carries his God with him, wherever he goes, and that is in his own cravings. These things may really be idols, I think they are myself, from what I have heard and read of idolatry, but they have come from some distant country, and like all the other articles, have fallen into Thomas Hutter's hands when he was a sailor." "I'm glad of it. I am downright glad to hear it, Judith, for I do not think I could have mustered the resolution to strive to help a white idolater out of his difficulties. The old man is of my color and nation, and I wish to sarve him; but as one who denied all his gifts, in the way of religion, it would have come hard to do so. That animal seems to give you great satisfaction, Sarpent, though it's an idolatrous beast at the best." "It is an elephant," interrupted Judith. "I've often seen pictures of such animals at the garrisons, and mother had a book in which there was a printed account of the creature. Father burnt that with all the other books, for he said mother loved reading too well. This was not long before mother died, and I've sometimes thought that the loss hastened her end." This was said equally without levity and without any very deep feeling. It was said without levity, for Judith was saddened by her recollections, and yet she had been too much accustomed to live for self, and for the indulgence of her own vanities, to feel her mother's wrongs very keenly. It required extraordinary circumstances to awaken a proper sense of her situation, and to stimulate the better feelings of this beautiful but misguided girl, and those circumstances had not yet occurred in her brief existence. "Elephant or no elephant, 'tis an idol," returned the hunter, "and not fit to remain in Christian keeping." "Good for Iroquois," said Chingachgook, parting with one of the castles with reluctance, as his friend took it from him to replace it in the bag. "Elephant by whole tribe, by Delaware, almost." "Ay, that it would, as any one who comprehends red-skin nature must know," answered Deerslayer. But the man that passes false money, Sarpent, is as bad as he who makes it. Did you ever know a just Injin that wouldn't scorn to sell a coon skin for the true marten, or to pass off a mink for a beaver? I know that a few of these idols, perhaps one of them elephants, would go far towards buying Thomas Hutter's liberty, but it goes ag'in conscience to pass such counterfeit money. Perhaps no Injin tribe, hereaway, is downright idolaters, but there's some that come so near it, that white gifts ought to be particular about encouraging them in their mistake." "If idolatry is a gift, Deerslayer, and gifts are what you seem to think them, idolatry in such people can hardly be a sin," said Judith, with more smartness than discrimination. "God grants no such gifts to any of his creatures, Judith," returned the hunter, seriously. "He must be adored under some name or other, and not creatures of brass or ivory. It matters not whether the Father of all is called God, or Manitou, Deity, or Great Spirit. He is none the less our common Maker and Master, nor does it count for much whether the souls of the just go to paradise or happy hunting grounds, since he may send each his own way, as suits his own pleasure and wisdom. But it curdles my blood, when I find human mortals so bound up in darkness and conceit, as to fashion the 'arth, or wood, or bones, things made by their own hands, into motionless, senseless effigies, and then fall down afore them, and worship them as a deity. After all, Deerslayer, these pieces of ivory may not be idols at all. I remember now to have seen one of the officers at the garrison with a set of fox and geese made in some such a design as these. And here is something hard, wrapped in cloth, that may belong to your idols." Deerslayer took the bundle the girl gave him, and unrolling it, he found the board within. Like the pieces it was large, rich, and inlaid with ebony and ivory. Putting the whole in conjunction, the hunter, though not without many misgivings, slowly came over to Judith's opinion, and finally admitted that the fancied idols must be merely the curiously carved men of some unknown game. Judith had the tact to use her victory with great moderation, nor did she once, even in the most indirect manner, allude to the ludicrous mistake of her companion. This discovery of the uses of the extraordinary-looking little images settled the affair of the proposed ransom. It was agreed generally, and all understood the weaknesses and tastes of Indians, that nothing could be more likely to tempt the cupidity of the Iroquois than the elephants, in particular. Luckily, the whole of the castles were among the pieces, and these 4 tower-bearing animals it was finally determined should be the ransom offered. The remainder of the men, and indeed all the rest of the articles in the chest, were to be kept out of view, and to be resorted to only as a last appeal. As soon as these preliminaries were settled, everything but those intended for the bribe was carefully replaced in the chest. All the covers were tucked in as they had been found, and it was quite possible, could Hutter have been put in possession of the castle again, that he might have passed the remainder of his days in it, without even suspecting the invasion that had been made on the privacy of the chest. The rent pistol would have been the most likely to reveal the secret, but this was placed by the side of its fellow, and all were pressed down as before, some half-a-dozen packages in the bottom of the chest not having been opened at all. When this was done, the lid was lowered, the padlocks replaced, and the key turned. The latter was then replaced in the pocket from which it had been taken. More than an hour was consumed in settling the course proper to be pursued, and in returning everything to its place. The pauses to converse were frequent, and Judith, who experienced a lively pleasure in the open, undisguised admiration with which Deerslayer's honest eyes gazed at her handsome face, found the means to prolong the interview, with a dexterity that seems to be innate in female coquetry. Deerslayer, indeed, appeared to be the first who was conscious of the time that had been thus wasted, and to call the attention of his companion to the necessity of doing something towards putting the plan of ransoming into execution. Chingachgook had remained in Hutter's bedroom, where the elephants were laid, to feast his eyes with the images of animals so wonderful and so novel. Perhaps an instinct told him that his presence would not be as acceptable to his companions as this holding himself aloof, for Judith had not much reserve in the manifestations of her preferences, and the Delaware had not got so far as one betrothed without acquiring some knowledge of the symptoms of the master passion. "Well, Judith," said Deerslayer, rising after the interview had lasted much longer than even he himself suspected, "'tis pleasant convarsing with you and settling all these matters, but duty calls us another way. All this time, Hurry and your father, not to say Hetty," the word was cut short in the speaker's mouth, for at that critical moment a light step was heard on the platform, or courtyard, a human figure darkened the doorway, and the person last mentioned stood before him. The low exclamation that escaped Deerslayer and the slight scream of Judith were hardly uttered, when an Indian youth, between the ages of 15 and 17, stood beside her. These two entrances had been made with moccasined feet, and consequently almost without noise, but unexpected and stealthy as they were, they had not the effect to disturb Deerslayer's self-possession. His first measure was to speak rapidly in Delaware to his friend, cautioning him to keep out of sight, while he stood on his guard. The second was to step to the door to ascertain the extent of the danger. No one else, however, had come, and a simple contrivance, in the shape of a raft, that lay floating at the side of the ark, at once explained the means that had been used in bringing Hetty off. Two dead and dry, and consequently buoyant, logs of pine were bound together with pins and withes, and a little platform of riven chestnut had been rudely placed on their surfaces. Here Hetty had been seated, on a billet of wood, while the young Iroquois had rowed the primitive and slow-moving, but perfectly safe craft from the shore. As soon as Deerslayer had taken a close survey of this raft, and satisfied himself nothing else was near, he shook his head and muttered in his soliloquizing way, "This comes of prying into another man's chist. Had we been watchful and keen-eyed, such a surprise could never have happened, and getting this much from a boy teaches us what we may expect when the old warriors set themselves fairly about their circumventions. It opens the way, howsever, to a treaty for the ransom, and I will hear what Hetty has to say." Judith, as soon as her surprise and alarm had a little abated, discovered a proper share of affectionate joy at the return of her sister. She folded her to her bosom, and kissed her, as had been her wont in the days of their childhood and innocence. Hetty herself was less affected, for to her there was no surprise, and her nerves were sustained by the purity and holiness of her purpose. At her sister's request, she took a seat, and entered into an account of her adventures since they had parted. Her tale commenced just as Deerslayer returned, and he also became an attentive listener, while the young Iroquois stood near the door, seemingly as indifferent to what was passing as one of its posts. The narrative of the girl was sufficiently clear until she reached the time where we left her in the camp, after the interview with the chiefs, and at the moment when Hist quitted her, in the abrupt manner already related. The sequel of the story may be told in her own language. "When I read the texts to the chiefs, Judith, you could not have seen that they made any changes on their minds," she said. "But if seed is planted, it will grow. God planted the seeds of all these trees." "Ay, that he did, muttered Deerslayer, "and a goodly harvest has followed." "God planted the seeds of all these trees," continued Hetty, after a moment's pause, "and you see to what a height and shade they have grown. So it is with the Bible. You may read a verse this year and forget it, and it will come back to you a year hence, when you least expect to remember it." "And did you find any thing of this among the savages, poor Hetty?" "Yes, Judith, and sooner and more fully than I had even hoped. I did not stay long with father and Hurry, but went to get my breakfast with Hist. As soon as we had done, the chiefs came to us, and then we found the fruits of the seed that had been planted. They said what I had read from the good book was right. It must be right. It sounded right, like a sweet bird singing in their ears. And they told me to come back and say as much to the great warrior who had slain one of their braves, and to tell it to you, and to say how happy they should be to come to church here, in the castle, or to come out in the sun, and hear me read more of the sacred volume, and to tell you that they wish you would lend them some canoes, that they can bring father and Hurry and their women to the castle, that we might all sit on the platform there and listen to the singing of the pale-face Manitou. There, Judith, Did you ever know of anything that so plainly shows the power of the Bible as that?" "If it were true, 'twould be a miracle indeed, Hetty. But all this is no more than Indian cunning and Indian treachery, striving to get the better of us by management, when they find it is not to be done by force." "Do you doubt the Bible, sister, that you judge the savages so harshly?" "I do not doubt the Bible, poor Hetty, but I much doubt an Indian and an Iroquois. What do you say to this visit, Deerslayer?" "First let me talk a little with Hetty," returned the party appealed to. "Was the raft made a'ter you had got your breakfast, gal, and did you walk from the camp to the shore opposite to us, here?" "Oh, no, Deerslayer, the raft was ready made and in the water. Could that have been by a miracle, Judith?" "Yes, yes, an Indian miracle," rejoined the hunter. "They're expart enough in them sort of miracles, and you found the raft ready made to your hands, and in the water, and in waiting like for its cargo?" "It was all as you say. The raft was near the camp, and the Indians put me on it, and had ropes of bark, and they dragged me to the place opposite to the castle, and then they told that young man to row me off, here. And the woods are full of the vagabonds waiting to know what is to be the upshot of the miracle. We comprehend this affair, now, Judith. But I'll first get rid of this young Canada bloodsucker, and then we'll settle our own course. Do you and Hetty leave us together, first bringing me the elephants, which the Sarpent is admiring, for 'twill never do to let this loping deer be alone a minute, or he'll borrow a canoe without asking." Judith did as desired, first bringing the pieces, and retiring with her sister into their own room. Deerslayer had acquired some knowledge of most of the Indian dialects of that region, and he knew enough of the Iroquois to hold a dialogue in the language. Beckoning to the lad, therefore, he caused him to take a seat on the chest, when he placed two of the castles suddenly before him. Up to that moment this youthful savage had not expressed a single intelligible emotion, or fancy. There were many things in and about the place that were novelties to him, but he had maintained his self-command with philosophical composure. It is true, Deerslayer had detected his dark eyes scanning the defences and the arms, but the scrutiny had been made with such an air of innocence, in such a gaping, indolent, boyish manner, that no one but a man who had himself been taught in a similar school would have even suspected his object. The instant, however, the eyes of the savage fell upon the wrought ivory, and the images of the wonderful unknown beasts, surprise and admiration got the mastery of him. The manner in which the natives of the South Sea Islands first beheld the toys of civilized life has been often described, but the reader is not to confound it with the manner of an American Indian, under similar circumstances. In this particular case, the young Iroquois or Huron permitted an exclamation of rapture to escape him, and then he checked himself like one who had been guilty of an indecorum. After this his eyes ceased to wander, but became riveted on the elephants, one of which, after a short hesitation, he even presumed to handle. Deerslayer did not interrupt him for quite 10 minutes, knowing that the lad was taking such note of the curiosities as would enable him to give the most minute and accurate description of their appearance to his seniors on his return. When he thought sufficient time had been allowed to produce the desired effect, the hunter laid a finger on the naked knee of the youth, and drew his attention to himself. "Listen," he said, "I want to talk with my young friend from the Canadas. Let him forget that wonder for a minute." "Where t'other pale brother?" demanded the boy, looking up, and letting the idea that had been most prominent in his mind previously to the introduction of the chessmen escape him involuntarily. "He sleeps, or if he isn't fairly asleep, he is in the room where the men do sleep," returned Deerslayer. "How did my young friend know there was another?" "See him from the shore. Iroquois have got long eyes. See beyond the clouds. See the bottom of the great spring." "Well, the Iroquois are welcome. 2 pale faces are prisoners in the camp of your fathers, boy." The lad nodded, treating the circumstance with great apparent indifference, though a moment after he laughed, as if exulting in the superior address of his own tribe. "Can you tell me, boy, what your chiefs intend to do with these captives, or haven't they yet made up their minds?" The lad looked a moment at the hunter with a little surprise. Then he coolly put the end of his forefinger on his own head, just above the left ear, and passed it round his crown with an accuracy and readiness that showed how well he had been drilled in the peculiar art of his race. "When?" demanded Deerslayer, whose gorge rose at this cool demonstration of indifference to human life. "And why not take them to your wigwams?" "Road too long, and full of pale-faces. Wigwam full, and scalps sell high. Small scalp, much gold." "Well, that explains it. Yes, that does explain it. There's no need of being any plainer. Now you know, lad, that the oldest of your prisoners is the father of these two young women, and the other is the suitor of one of them. The gals naturally wish to save the scalps of such friends, and they will give them 2 ivory creatures as ransom, 1 for each scalp. Go back and tell this to your chiefs, and bring me the answer before the sun sets." The boy entered zealously into this project, and with a sincerity that left no doubt of his executing his commission with intelligence and promptitude. For a moment he forgot his love of honor, and all his clannish hostility to the British and their Indians, in his wish to have such a treasure in his tribe, and Deerslayer was satisfied with the impression he had made. It is true the lad proposed to carry one of the elephants with him as a specimen of the other, but to this his brother negotiator was too sagacious to consent, well knowing that it might never reach its destination if confided to such hands. This little difficulty was soon arranged, and the boy prepared to depart. As he stood on the platform, ready to step aboard of the raft, he hesitated, and turned short with a proposal to borrow a canoe, as the means most likely to shorten the negotiations. Deerslayer quietly refused the request, and after lingering a little longer the boy rowed slowly away from the castle, taking the direction of a thicket on the shore that lay less than half a mile distant. Deerslayer seated himself on a stool, and watched the progress of the ambassador, sometimes closely scanning the whole line of shore, as far as eye could reach, and then placing an elbow on a knee, he remained a long time with his chin resting on the hand. During the interview between Deerslayer and the lad, a different scene took place in the adjoining room. Hetty had inquired for the Delaware, and being told why and where he remained concealed, she joined him. The reception which Chingachgook gave his visitor was respectful and gentle. He understood her character, and no doubt his disposition to be kind to such a being was increased by the hope of learning some tidings of his betrothed. As soon as the girl entered she took a seat, and invited the Indian to place himself near her. Then she continued silent, as if she thought it decorous for him to question her, before she consented to speak on the subject she had in her mind. But, as Chingachgook did not understand this feeling, he remained respectfully attentive to anything she might be pleased to tell him. "You are Chingachgook, the Great Serpent of the Delawares, aren't you?" the girl at length commenced, in her own simple way, losing her self-command in the desire to proceed, but anxious first to make sure of the individual. "Chingachgook," returned the Delaware, with grave dignity. "That say Great Sarpent, in Deerslayer tongue." "Well, that is my tongue. Deerslayer, and father, and Judith, and I, and poor Hurry Harry. Do you know Henry March, Great Serpent? I know you don't, however, or he would have spoken of you too." "Did any tongue name Chingachgook, Drooping Lily?" for so the chief had named poor Hetty. "Was his name sung by a little bird among Iroquois?" Hetty did not answer at first, but with that indescribable feeling that awakens sympathy and intelligence among the youthful and unpractised of her sex, she hung her head, and the blood suffused her cheek ere she found her tongue. It would have exceeded her stock of intelligence to explain this embarrassment; but, though poor Hetty could not reason, on every emergency, she could always feel. The color slowly receded from her cheeks, and the girl looked up archly at the Indian, smiling with the innocence of a child, mingled with the interest of a woman. "My sister, the Drooping Lily, hear such bird," Chingachgook added, and this with a gentleness of tone and manner that would have astonished those who sometimes heard the discordant cries that often came from the same throat. these transitions from the harsh and guttural to the soft and melodious not being infrequent in ordinary Indian dialogues. "My sister's ears were open. Has she lost her tongue?" "You are Chingachgook. You must be, for there is no other red man here, and she thought Chingachgook would come." Chingachgook, pronouncing the name slowly and dwelling on each syllable. "Great Sarpent, Yengeese tongue." It is singular there should be any question concerning the origin of the well-known sobriquet of Yankees. Nearly all the old writers who speak of the Indians first known to the colonists make them pronounce the word English as Yengeese. Even at this day, it is a provincialism of New England to say English instead of English, and there is a close conformity of sound between English and Yengeese, more especially if the latter word, as was probably the case, be pronounced short. The transition from Yengeese, thus pronounced, to Yankees is quite easy. If the former is pronounced Yangis, it is almost identical with Yankees, and Indian words have seldom been spelt as they are pronounced. Thus the scene of this tale is spelt Otsego, and is properly pronounced Otsego. The liquids of the Indians would easily convert N into Yen. "Chingachgook," repeated Hetty in the same deliberate manner. "Yes, so Hist called it, and you must be the chief." "Wah-ta-Wah," added the Delaware. "Wah-ta-Wah, or Hist-oh-Hist. I think Hist prettier than Wah, and so I call her Hist. Wah very sweet in Delaware ears." "You make it sound differently from me, but never mind. I did hear the bird you speak of sing, Great Serpent." "Will my sister say words of song? What she sing most? How she look? Often she laugh?" "She sang Chingachgook oftener than any thing else, and she laughed heartily, when I told how the Iroquois waded into the water after us, and couldn't catch us. I hope these logs haven't ears, Serpent." "No fear logs. Fear sister next room. No fear Iroquois. Deerslayer stuff his eyes and ears with strange beast." "I understand you, Serpent, and I understood Hist. Sometimes I think I'm not half as feeble-minded as they say I am. Now, do you look up at the roof, and I'll tell you all. But you frighten me, you look so eager when I speak of Hist." The Indian controlled his looks, and affected to comply with the simple request of the girl. "Hist told me to say in a very low voice that you mustn't trust the Iroquois in anything. They are more artful than any Indians she knows. Then she says that there is a large bright star that comes over the hill about an hour after dark." Hist had pointed out the planet Jupiter without knowing it. "And just as that star comes in sight, she will be on the point, where I landed last night, and that you must come for her, in a canoe." "Good. Chingachgook understand well enough, now, but he understand better if my sisters sing him ag'in." Hetty repeated her words, more fully explaining what star was meant, and mentioning the part of the point where he was to venture ashore. She now proceeded in her own unsophisticated way to relate her intercourse with the Indian maid, and to repeat several of her expressions and opinions that gave great delight to the heart of her betrothed. She particularly renewed her injunctions to be on their guard against treachery, a warning that was scarcely needed, however, as addressed to men as wary as those to whom it was sent. She also explained with sufficient clearness, for on all such subjects the mind of the girl seldom failed her, the present state of the enemy, and the movements they had made since morning. Hist had been on the raft with her until it quitted the shore, and was now somewhere in the woods, opposite to the castle, and did not intend to return to the camp until night approached, when she hoped to be able to slip away from her companions as they followed the shore on their way home, and conceal herself on the point. No one appeared to suspect the presence of Chingachgook, though it was necessarily known that an Indian had entered the Ark the previous night, and it was suspected that he had since appeared in and about the castle, in the dress of a pale-face. Still some little doubt existed on the latter point, for as this was the season when white men might be expected to arrive, there was some fear that the garrison of the castle was increasing by these ordinary means. All this had Hist communicated to Hetty, while the Indians were dragging them along shore, the distance, which exceeded 6 miles, affording abundance of time. "Hist don't know, herself, whether they suspect her or not, or whether they suspect you, but she hopes neither is the case. And now, Serpent, since I have told you so much from your betrothed," continued Hetty, unconsciously taking one of the Indian's hands and playing with the fingers as a child is often seen to play with those of a parent, "you must let me tell you something from myself. When you marry Hist, you must be kind to her, and smile on her, as you do now on me, and not look cross, as some of the chiefs do at their squaws. Will you promise this?" "Alway good to Wah. Too tender to twist hard, else she break." "Yes, and smile, too. You don't know how much a girl craves smiles from them she loves. Father scarce smiled on me once, while I was with him, and Hurry, yes, Hurry talked loud and laughed, but I don't think he smiled once either. You know the difference between a smile and a laugh?" "Laugh best. Hear Wah laugh, think birds sing." "I know that. Her laugh is pleasant. But you must smile, and then, Serpent, you mustn't make her carry burthens, and hoe corn, as so many Indians do, but treat her more as the pale faces treat their wives." "Wah ta Wah no pale face. Got red skin, red heart, red feelin's, all red. No pale face. Must carry papoose." "Every woman is willing to carry her child," said Hetty, smiling, "and there is no harm in that, but you must love Hist, and be gentle and good to her, for she is gentle and good herself." Chingachgook gravely bowed, and then he seemed to think this part of the subject might be dismissed. Before there was time for Hetty to resume her communications, the voice of Deerslayer was heard calling on his friend, in the outer room. At this summons the Serpent rose to obey, and Hetty joined her sister. Chapter 13. Recording by Bill Borst. Chapter 14 of the Deerslayer. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Deerslayer, by James Fenimore Cooper. Chapter 14. "A stranger animal," cries one, "sure never lived beneath the sun. A lizard's body, lean and long, a fish's head, a serpent's tongue, its foot with triple claw disjoined, and what a length of tail behind." James Merrick, The Chameleon, 11, lines 21 through 26. The first act of the Delaware, on rejoining his friend, was to proceed gravely to disencumber himself of his civilized attire, and to stand forth an Indian warrior again. The protest of Deerslayer was met by his communicating the fact that the presence of an Indian in the hut was known to the Iroquois, and that maintaining the disguise would be more likely to direct suspicions to his real object, than if he came out openly as a member of a hostile tribe. When the latter understood the truth, and was told that he had been deceived in supposing the chief had succeeded in entering the ark undiscovered, he cheerfully consented to the change, since further attempt at concealment was useless. A gentler feeling than the one avowed, however, lay at the bottom of the Indian's desire to appear as a son of the forest. He had been told that Hist was on the opposite shore, and nature so far triumphed over all distinctions of habit, and tribes and people, as to reduce this young savage warrior to the level of a feeling which would have been found in the most refined inhabitant of a town, under similar circumstances. There was a mild satisfaction in believing that she he loved could see him, and as he walked out on the platform in his scanty native attire, an Apollo of the wilderness, 100 of the tender fancies that fleet through lovers' brains beset his imagination, and softened his heart. All this was lost on Deerslayer, who was no great adept in the mysteries of Cupid, but whose mind was far more occupied with the concerns that forced themselves on his attention than with any of the truant fancies of love. He soon recalled his companion, therefore, to a sense of their actual condition, by summoning him to a sort of council of war, in which they were to settle their future course. In the dialogue that followed, the parties mutually made each other acquainted with what had passed in their several interviews, Chingachgook was told the history of the treaty about the ransom, and Deerslayer heard the whole of Hetty's communications. The latter listened with generous interest to his friend's hopes, and promised cheerfully all the assistance he could lend. "'Tis our main ar'n'd, Sarpent, as you know, this battling for the castle and old Hutter's darters coming in as a sort of accident." "Yes, yes. I'll be active in helping little Hist, who's not only one of the best and handsomest maidens of the tribe, but the very best and handsomest. I've always encouraged you, chief, in that liking, and it's proper, too, that a great and ancient race like your'n shouldn't come to an end. If a woman of red skin and red gifts could get to be near enough to me to wish her for a wife, I'd s'arch for just such another. But that can never be. No, that can never be. I'm glad Hetty has met with Hist, however, for though the first is a little short of wit and understanding, the last has enough for both. Yes, Sarpent," laughing heartily, "put 'em together, and two smarter gals isn't to be found in all York Colony." "I will go to the Iroquois camp," returned the Delaware gravely. "No one knows Chingachgook but Wah, and a treaty for lives and scalps should be made by a chief. Give me the strange beasts, and let me take a canoe." Deerslayer dropped his head and played with the end of a fish-pole in the water, as he sat dangling his legs over the edge of the platform, like a man who was lost in thought by the sudden occurrence of a novel idea. Instead of directly answering the proposal of his friend, he began to soliloquize, a circumstance, however, that in no manner rendered his words more true, as he was remarkable for saying what he thought, whether the remarks were addressed to himself or to any one else. "Yes, yes," he said, "this must be what they call love. I've heard say that it sometimes upsets reason altogether, leaving a young man as helpless as to calculation and caution as a brute beast. To think that the Sarpent should be so lost to reason, and cunning, and wisdom! We must sartainly manage to get Hist off, and have 'em married as soon as we get back to the tribe, or this war will be of no more use to the chief than a hunt a little oncommon extraordinary. Yes, yes, he'll never be the man he was till this matter is off his mind, and he comes to his senses like all the rest of mankind. Sarpent, you can't be in earnest, and therefore I shall say but little to your offer. But you're a chief, and will soon be sent out on the war-path at head of the parties, and I'll just ask you if you'd think of putting your forces into the enemy's hands, afore the battle is fought." "Wah!" ejaculated the Indian. "Ay, wah! I know well enough it's wah, and altogether wah. Ra'ally, Sarpent, I'm concerned and mortified about you. I never heard so weak an idee come from a chief, and he, too, one that's already got a name for being wise, young and inexperienced as he is. Canoe you shan't have, so long as the vice of friendship and warning can count for anything." My pale-face friend is right. A cloud came over the face of Chingachgook, and weakness got into his mind, while his eyes were dim. My brother has a good memory for good deeds, and a weak memory for bad. He will forget. "Yes, that's easy enough. Say no more about it, chief. But if another of them clouds blow near you, do your endeavors to get out of its way. Clouds are bad enough in the weather, but when they come to the reason, it gets to be serious. Now, sit down by me here, and let us calculate our movements a little, for we shall soon either have a truce and a peace, or we shall come to an active and bloody war. You see the vagabonds can make logs sarve their turn, as well as the best raftsmen on the rivers, and it would be no great expl'ite for them to invade us in a body. I've been thinking of the wisdom of putting all old Tom's stores into the ark, of barring and locking up the castle, and of taking to the ark altogether. That is movable, and by keeping the sail up, and shifting places, we might worry through a great many nights, without them Canada wolves finding a way into our sheepfold." Chingachgook listened to this plan with approbation. Did the negotiation fail, there was now little hope that the night would pass without an assault, and the enemy had sagacity enough to understand that in carrying the castle they would probably become masters of all it contained, the offered ransom included, and still retain the advantages they had hitherto gained. Some precaution of the sort appeared to be absolutely necessary, for now the numbers of the Iroquois were known, a night attack could scarcely be successfully met. It would be impossible to prevent the enemy from getting possession of the canoes and the Ark, and the latter itself would be a hold in which the assailants would be as effectually protected against bullets as were those in the building. For a few minutes, both the men thought of sinking the Ark in the shallow water, of bringing the canoes into the house, and of depending altogether on the castle for protection. But reflection satisfied them that, in the end, this expedient would fail. It was so easy to collect logs on the shore, and to construct a raft of almost any size, that it was certain the Iroquois, now they had turned their attention to such means, would resort to them seriously, so long as there was the certainty of success by perseverance. After deliberating maturely, and placing all the considerations fairly before them, the two young beginners in the art of forest warfare settled down into the opinion that the Ark offered the only available means of security. This decision was no sooner come to than it was communicated to Judith. The girl had no serious objection to make, and all four set about the measures necessary to carrying the plan into execution. The reader will readily understand that Floating Tom's worldly goods were of no great amount. A couple of beds, some wearing apparel, the arms and ammunition, a few cooking utensils, with the mysterious and but half-examined chest formed the principal items. These were all soon removed, the Ark having been hauled on the eastern side of the building, so that the transfer could be made without being seen from the shore. It was thought unnecessary to disturb the heavier and coarser articles of furniture, as they were not required in the Ark, and were of but little value in themselves. As great caution was necessary in removing the different objects, most of which were passed out of a window with a view to conceal what was going on, it required 2 or 3 hours before all could be effected. By the expiration of that time, the raft made its appearance, moving from the shore. Deerslayer immediately had recourse to the glass, by the aid of which he perceived that 2 warriors were on it, though they appeared to be unarmed. The progress of the raft was slow, a circumstance that formed one of the great advantages that would be possessed by the scow, in any future collision between them, the movements of the latter being comparatively swift and light. As there was time to make the dispositions for the reception of the 2 dangerous visitors, everything was prepared for them, long before they had got near enough to be hailed. The Serpent and the girls retired into the building, where the former stood near the door, well provided with rifles, while Judith watched the proceedings without, through a loop. As for Deerslayer, he had brought a stool to the edge of the platform, at the point towards which the raft was advancing, and taken his seat with his rifle leaning carelessly between his legs. As the raft drew nearer, every means possessed by the party in the castle was resorted to, in order to ascertain if their visitors had any firearms. Neither Deerslayer nor Chingachgook could discover any, but Judith, unwilling to trust to simple eyesight, thrust the glass through the loop, and directed it towards the hemlock boughs that lay between the 2 logs of the raft, forming a sort of flooring, as well as a seat for the use of the rowers. When the heavy moving craft was within 50 feet of him, Deerslayer hailed the Hurons, directing them to cease rowing, it not being his intention to permit them to land. Compliance, of course, was necessary, and the 2 grim-looking warriors instantly quitted their seats, though the raft continued slowly to approach, until it had driven in much nearer to the platform. "Are ye chiefs?" demanded Deerslayer with dignity. "Are ye chiefs? Or have the Mingos sent me warriors without names on such an ar'n'd? If so, the sooner you go back, the sooner them will be likely to come that a warrior can talk with." "Hugh!" exclaimed the elder of the 2 on the raft, rolling his glowing eyes over the different objects that were visible in and about the castle, with a keenness that showed how little escaped him. "My brother is very proud, but Rivenoak," we use the literal translation of the term, writing as we do in English, "is a name to make a Delaware turn pale." "That's true, or it's a lie, Rivenoak, as it may be, but I am not likely to turn pale, seeing that I was born pale. What's your errand, and why do you come among the light bark canoes on logs that are not even dug out?" "The Iroquois are not ducks, to walk on water. Let the pale faces give them a canoe, and they'll come in a canoe. That's more rational than likely to come to pass. We have but 4 canoes, and being 4 persons, that's only one for each of us. We thank you for the offer, howsever, though we ask leave not to accept it. You are welcome, Iroquois, on your logs." "Thanks." "My young pale-face warrior. He has got a name. How do the chiefs call him?" Deerslayer hesitated a moment, and a gleam of pride and human weakness came over him. He smiled, muttered between his teeth, and then looking up proudly, he said, "Mingo, like all who are young and active, I've been known by different names at different times. One of your warriors, whose spirit started for the happy grounds of your people, as lately as yesterday morning, thought I deserved to be known by the name of Hawkeye, and this because my sight happened to be quicker than his own, when it got to be life or death atween us." Chingachgook, who was attentively listening to all that passed, heard and understood this proof of passing weakness in his friend, and on a future occasion he questioned him more closely concerning the transaction on the point, where Deerslayer had first taken human life. When he had got the whole truth, he did not fail to communicate it to the tribe, from which time the young hunter was universally known among the Delawares by an appellation so honorably earned. As this, however, was a period posterior to all the incidents of this tale, we shall continue to call the young hunter by the name under which he has been first introduced to the reader. Nor was the Iroquois less struck with the vaunt of the white man. He knew of the death of his comrade, and had no difficulty in understanding the allusion, the intercourse between the conqueror and his victim on that occasion having been seen by several savages on the shore of the lake, who had been stationed at different points just within the margin of bushes to watch the drifting canoes, and who had not time to reach the scene of action ere the victor had retired. The effect on this rude being of the forest was an exclamation of surprise. Then such a smile of courtesy and wave of the hand succeeded, as would have done credit to Asiatic diplomacy. The 2 Iroquois spoke to each other in low tones, and both drew near the end of the raft that was closest to the platform. "My brother, Hawkeye, has sent a message to the Hurons," resumed Rivenoak, "and it has made their hearts very glad. They hear he has images of beasts with 2 tails. Will he show them to his friends?" "Inimies would be truer," returned Deerslayer, "but sound isn't sense, and does little harm. Here is one of the images. I toss it to you under the faith of treaties. If it's not returned, the rifle will settle the p'int atween us." The Iroquois seemed to acquiesce in the conditions, and Deerslayer arose and prepared to toss one of the elephants to the raft, both parties using all the precaution that was necessary to prevent its loss. As practice renders men expert in such things, the little piece of ivory was soon successfully transferred from one hand to the other, and then followed another scene on the raft, in which astonishment and delight got the mastery of Indian stoicism. These 2 grim old warriors manifested even more feeling, as they examined the curiously wrought chessman, than had been betrayed by the boy, for in the case of the latter, recent schooling had interposed its influence, while the men, like all who are sustained by well-established characters, were not ashamed to let some of their emotions be discovered. For a few minutes, they apparently lost the consciousness of their situation, in the intense scrutiny they bestowed on a material so fine, work so highly wrought, and an animal so extraordinary. The lip of the moose is, perhaps, the nearest approach to the trunk of the elephant that is to be found in the American forest, but this resemblance was far from being sufficiently striking to bring the new creature within the range of their habits and ideas, and the more they studied the image, the greater was their astonishment. Nor did these children of the forest mistake the structure on the back of the elephant for a part of the animal. They were familiar with horses and oxen, and had seen towers in the Canadas, and found nothing surprising in creatures of burthen. Still, by a very natural association, they supposed the carving meant to represent that the animal they saw was of a strength sufficient to carry a fort on its back, a circumstance that in no degree lessened their wonder. "Has my pale-face brother any more such beasts?" at last the senior of the Iroquois asked, in a sort of petitioning manner. "There's more where them came from, Mingo," was the answer. "One is enough, howsever, to buy off 50 scalps. One of my prisoners is a great warrior, tall as a pine, strong as the moose, active as a deer, fierce as the panther. Some day he'll be a great chief, and lead the army of King George." "Tut, tut, Mingo, Hurry Harry is Hurry Harry, and you'll never make more than a corporal of him if you do that. He's tall enough, of a sartainty, but that's of no use, as he only hits his head ag'in the branches as he goes through the forest. He's strong, too, but a strong body isn't a strong head, and the king's generals are not chosen for their sinews. He's swift, if you will, but a rifle bullet is swifter. And as for fierceness, it's no great ricommend to a soldier. They that think they feel the stoutest often givin' out at the pinch. No, no, you'll never make Hurry's scalp pass for more than a good head of curly hair, and a rattle-pate beneath it. My old prisoner very wise, king of the lake, great warrior, wise counsellor." "Well, there's them that might gainsay all this, too, Mingo. A very wise man wouldn't be apt to be taken in so foolish a manner as befell Master Hutter, and if he gives good counsel, he must have listened to very bad in that affair. There's only one king of this lake, and he's a long way off, and isn't likely ever to see it. Floating Tom is some such king of this region, as the wolf that prowls through the woods is king of the forest. A beast with 2 tails is well worth 2 such scalps." "But my brother has another beast? He will give 2, holding up as many fingers, for old father?" "Floating Tom is no father of mine, but he'll fare none the worse for that. As for giving 2 beasts for his scalp, and each beast with 2 tails, it is quite beyond reason. Think yourself well off, Mingo, if you make a much worse trade." By this time the self-command of Rivenoak had got the better of his wonder, and he began to fall back on his usual habits of cunning, in order to drive the best bargain he could. It would be useless to relate more than the substance of the desultory dialogue that followed, in which the Indian manifested no little management in endeavoring to recover the ground lost under the influence of surprise. He even affected to doubt whether any original for the image of the beast existed, and asserted that the oldest Indian had never heard a tradition of any such animal. Little did either of them imagine at the time that, long ere a century elapsed, the progress of civilization would bring even much more extraordinary and rare animals into that region, as curiosities to be gazed at by the curious, and that the particular beast about which the disputants contended would be seen laving its sides and swimming in the very sheet of water on which they had met. The Otsego is a favorite place for the caravan keepers to let their elephants bathe. The writer has seen 2 at a time, since the publication of this book, swimming about in company. As is not uncommon on such occasions, one of the parties got a little warm in the course of the discussion, for Deerslayer met all the arguments and prevarication of his subtle opponent with his own cool directness of manner, and unmoved love of truth. What an elephant was he knew little better than the savage, but he perfectly understood that the carved pieces of ivory must have some such value in the eyes of an Iroquois as a bag of gold or a package of beaver skins would in those of a trader. Under the circumstances, therefore, he felt it to be prudent not to concede too much at first, since there existed a nearly unconquerable obstacle to making the transfers, even after the contracting parties had actually agreed upon the terms. Keeping this difficulty in view, he held the extra chessmen in reserve, as a means of smoothing any difficulty in the moment of need. At length the savage pretended that further negotiation was useless, since he could not be so unjust to his tribe as to part with the honor and emoluments of 2 excellent full-grown male scalps, for a consideration so trifling as a toy like that he had seen, and he prepared to take his departure. Both parties now felt as men are wont to feel when a bargain that each is anxious to conclude is on the eve of being broken off, in consequence of too much pertinacity in the way of management. The effect of the disappointment was very different, however, on the respective individuals. Deerslayer was mortified and filled with regret, for he not only felt for the prisoners, but he also felt deeply for the 2 girls. The conclusion of the treaty, therefore, left him melancholy and full of regret. With the savage, his defeat produced the desire of revenge. In a moment of excitement he had loudly announced his intention to say no more, and he felt equally enraged with himself and with his cool opponent that he had permitted a pale-face to manifest more indifference and self-command than an Indian chief. When he began to urge his raft away from the platform, his countenance lowered and his eye glowed, even while he affected a smile of amity and a gesture of courtesy at parting. It took some little time to overcome the inertia of the logs, and while this was being done by the silent Indian, Rivenoak stalked over the hemlock boughs that lay between the logs in sullen ferocity, eyeing keenly the while the hut, the platform, and the person of his late disputant. Once he spoke in low, quick tones to his companion, and he stirred the boughs with his feet like an animal that is restive. At that moment the watchfulness of Deerslayer had a little abated, for he sat musing on the means of renewing the negotiation without giving too much advantage to the other side. It was perhaps fortunate for him that the keen and bright eyes of Judith were as vigilant as ever. At the instant when the young man was least on his guard, and his enemy was the most on the alert, she called out in a warning voice to the former, most opportunely giving the alarm. "Be on your guard, Deerslayer," the girl cried. "I see rifles, with the glass, beneath the hemlock brush, and the Iroquois is loosening them with his feet." It would seem that the enemy had carried their artifices so far as to employ an agent who understood English. The previous dialogue had taken place in his own language, but it was evident by the sudden manner in which his feet ceased their treacherous occupation, and in which the countenance of Rivenoak changed from sullen ferocity to a smile of courtesy, that the call of the girl was understood. Signing to his companion to cease his efforts to set the logs in motion, he advanced to the end of the raft, which was nearest to the platform, and spoke. "Why should Rivenoak and his brother leave any cloud between them?" he said. "They are both wise, both brave, and both generous. They ought to part friends. One beast shall be the price of one prisoner." "And Mingo," answered the other, delighted to renew the negotiations on almost any terms, and determined to clinch the bargain, if possible, by a little extra liberality. "You'll see that a pale-face knows how to pay a full price, when he trades with an open heart and an open hand. Keep the beast that you had forgotten to give back to me, as you was about to start, and which I forgot to ask for on account of consarn at parting in anger. Show it to your chiefs. When you bring us our friends, 2 more shall be added to it, and," hesitating a moment in distrust of the expediency of so great a concession, then deciding in its favor, "and, if we see them before the sun sets, we may find a 4th to make up an even number." This settled the matter. Every gleam of discontent vanished from the dark countenance of the Iroquois, and he smiled as graciously, if not as sweetly, as Judith Hutter herself. The piece already in his possession was again examined, and an ejaculation of pleasure showed how much he was pleased with this unexpected termination of the affair. In point of fact, both he and Deerslayer had momentarily forgotten what had become the subject of their discussion, in the warmth of their feelings, but such had not been the case with Rivenoak's companion. This man retained the piece, and had fully made up his mind, were it claimed under such circumstances as to render its return necessary, to drop it in the lake, trusting to his being able to find it again at some future day. This desperate expedient, however, was no longer necessary, and after repeating the terms of agreement, and professing to understand them, the 2 Indians finally took their departure, moving slowly towards the shore. "Can any faith be put in such wretches?" asked Judith, when she and Hetty had come out on the platform and were standing at the side of Deerslayer, watching the dull movement of the logs. "Will they not rather keep the toy they have, and send us off some bloody proofs of their getting the better of us in cunning, by way of boasting? I've heard of acts as bad as this." "No doubt, Judith, no manner of doubt, if it wasn't for Indian nature. But I'm no judge of a red skin, if that 2-tailed beast doesn't set the whole tribe in some such stir as a stick raises in a beehive. Now, there's the Sarpent, a man with narves like flint, and no more curiosity in everyday consarns than is befitting prudence. Why, he was so overcome with the sight of the creatur', carved as it is in bone, that I felt ashamed for him. That's just their gifts, howsever, and one can't quarrel with a man for his gifts, when they are lawful. Chingachgook will soon get over his weakness, and remember that he's a chief, and that he comes of a great stock, and has a renowned name to support and uphold. But as for yonder scamps, there'll be no peace among 'em, till they think they've got possession of every thing of the natur' of that bit of carved bone that's to be found among Thomas Hutter's stores. They only know of the elephants, and can have no hopes about the other things." "That's true, Judith. Still, covetousness is a craving feelin'. They'll say, if the pale faces have these curious beasts with 2 tails, who knows but they've got some with 3, or for that matter with 4. That's what the schoolmasters call nat'ral arithmetic, and 'twill be sartain to beset the feelin's of savages. They'll never be easy, till the truth is known." "Do you think, Deerslayer," inquired Hetty, in her simple and innocent manner, "that the Iroquois won't let father and Hurry go? I read to them several of the very best verses in the whole Bible, and you see what they have done already." The hunter, as he always did, listened kindly and even affectionately to Hetty's remarks. Then he mused a moment in silence. There was something like a flush on his cheek as he answered, after quite a minute had passed. "I don't know whether a white man ought to be ashamed or not, to own he can't read. But such is my case, Judith. You are skilful, I find, in all such matters, while I have only studied the hand of God as it is seen in the hills and the valleys, the mountain tops, the streams, the forests, and the springs. Much l'arning may be got in this way, as well as out of books, and yet I sometimes think it is a white man's gift to read. When I hear from the mouths of the Moravians the words of which Hetty speaks, they raise a longing in my mind, and I then think I will know how to read 'em myself. But the game in summer, and the traditions, and lessons in war, and other matters, have always kept me behindhand." "Shall I teach you, Deerslayer?" asked Hetty earnestly. "I'm weak-minded, they say, but I can read as well as Judith. It might save your life to know how to read the Bible to the savages, and it will certainly save your soul, for mother told me that, again and again." "Thankee, Hetty. Yes, thankee, with all my heart. These are like to be too stirring times for much idleness. But after it's peace, and I come to see you again on this lake, then I'll give myself up to it, as if 'twas pleasure and profit in a single business. Perhaps I ought to be ashamed, Judith, that 'tis so, but truth is truth. As for these Iroquois, 'tisn't very likely they'll forget a beast with 2 tails, on account of a varse or 2 from the Bible. I rather expect they'll give up the prisoners, and trust to some sarcumvenion or other to get 'em back ag'in with us and all in the castle and the ark in the bargain. Howsever, we must humor the vagabonds, first to get your father and Hurry out of their hands, and next to keep the peace atween us, until such time as the Sarpent there can make out to get off his betrothed wife. If there's any sudden outbreakin' of anger and ferocity, the Indians will send off all their women and children to the camp at once, whereas, by keeping 'em calm and trustful, we may manage to meet Hist at the spot she has mentioned. Rather than have the bargain fall through, now, I'd throw in half a dozen of them effigy bow and arrow men, such as we've in plenty in the chist." Judith cheerfully assented, for she would have resigned even the flowered brocade, rather than not redeem her father and please Deerslayer. The prospects of success were now so encouraging as to raise the spirits of all in the castle, though a due watchfulness of the movements of the enemy was maintained. Hour passed after hour, notwithstanding, and the sun had once more begun to fall towards the summits of the western hills, and yet no signs were seen of the return of the raft. By dint of sweeping the shore with the glass, Deerslayer at length discovered a place in the dense and dark woods where, he entertained no doubt, the Iroquois were assembled in considerable numbers. It was near the thicket whence the craft had issued, and a little rill that trickled into the lake announced the vicinity of a spring. Here, then, the savages were probably holding their consultation, and the decision was to be made that went to settle the question of life or death for the prisoners. There was one ground for hope in spite of the delay, however, that Deerslayer did not fail to place before his anxious companions. It was far more probable that the Indians had left their prisoners in the camp, than that they had encumbered themselves by causing them to follow through the woods a party that was out on a merely temporary excursion. If such was the fact, it required considerable time to send a messenger the necessary distance, and to bring the two white men to the spot where they were to embark. Encouraged by these reflections, a new stock of patience was gathered, and the declension of the sun was viewed with less alarm. The result justified Deerslayer's conjecture. Not long before the sun had finally disappeared, the two logs were seen coming out of the thicket again, and as it drew near, Judith announced that her father and Hurry, both of them pinioned, lay on the bushes in the centre. As before, the two Indians were rowing. The latter seemed to be conscious that the lateness of the hour demanded unusual exertions, and contrary to the habits of their people, who are ever averse to toil, they labored hard at the rude substitutes for oars. In consequence of this diligence, the raft occupied its old station in about half the time that had been taken in the previous visits. Even after the conditions were so well understood, and matters had proceeded so far, the actual transfer of the prisoners was not a duty to be executed without difficulty. The Iroquois were compelled to place great reliance on the good faith of their foes, though it was reluctantly given, and was yielded to necessity rather than to confidence. As soon as Hutter and Hurry should be released, the party in the castle numbered 2 to 1, as opposed to those on the raft, and escape by flight was out of the question, as the former had 3 bark canoes, to say nothing of the defences of the house and the ark. All this was understood by both parties, and it is probable the arrangement never could have been completed, had not the honest countenance and manner of Deerslayer wrought their usual effect on Rivenoak. "My brother knows I put faith in him," said the latter, as he advanced with Hutter, whose legs had been released to enable the old man to ascend to the platform. "One scalp, one more beast." "Stop, Mingo," interrupted the hunter. "Keep your prisoner a moment. I have to go and seek the means of payment." This excuse, however, though true in part, was principally a fetch. Deerslayer left the platform, and entering the house, he directed Judith to collect all the arms and to conceal them in her own room. He then spoke earnestly to the Delaware, who stood on guard as before, near the entrance of the building, put the 3 remaining castles in his pocket, and returned. "You are welcome back to your old abode, Master Hutter," said Deerslayer, as he helped the other up on the platform, slyly passing into the hand of Rivenoak at the same time another of the castles. "You'll find your darters right glad to see you, and here's Hetty come herself to say as much in her own behalf." Here the hunter stopped speaking, and broke out into a hearty fit of his silent and peculiar laughter. Hurry's legs were just released, and he had been placed on his feet. So tightly had the ligatures been drawn, that the use of his limbs was not immediately recovered, and the young giant presented, in good sooth, a very helpless and a somewhat ludicrous picture. It was this unusual spectacle, particularly the bewildered countenance, that excited the merriment of Deerslayer. "You look like a girdled pine in a clearin', Hurry Harry, that is rocking in a gale," said Deerslayer, checking his unseasonable mirth, more from delicacy to the others than from any respect to the liberated captive. "I'm glad, howsever, to see that you haven't had your hair dressed by any of the Iroquois barbers, in your late visit to their camp." "Harkee, Deerslayer," returned the other a little fiercely, "it will be prudent for you to deal less in mirth and more in friendship on this occasion. Act like a Christian, for once, and not like a laughing gal in a country school when the master's back is turned, and just tell me whether there's any feet or not at the end of these legs of mine. I think I can see them, but as for feelin', they might as well be down on the banks of the Mohawk, as be where they seem to be." "You've come off whole, Hurry, and that's not a little," answered the other, secretly passing to the Indian the remainder of the stipulated ransom, and making an earnest sign at the same moment for him to commence his retreat. "You've come off whole, feet and all, and are only a little numb from a tight fit of the withes. Nature'll soon set the blood in motion, and then you may begin to dance to celebrate what I call a most wonderful and unexpected deliverance from a den of wolves." Deerslayer released the arms of his friends as each landed, and the two were now stamping and limping about on the platform, growling and uttering denunciations as they endeavored to help the returning circulation. They had been tethered too long, however, to regain the use of their limbs in a moment, and the Indians being quite as diligent on their return as on their advance, the raft was fully 100 yards from the castle when Hurry turning accidentally in that direction, discovered how fast it was getting beyond the reach of his vengeance. By this time he could move with tolerable facility, though still numb and awkward. Without considering his own situation, however, he seized the rifle that leaned against the shoulder of Deerslayer, and attempted to cock and present it. The young hunter was too quick for him. Seizing the piece, he wrenched it from the hands of the giant, not, however, until it had gone off in the struggle, when pointed directly upward. It is probable that Deerslayer could have prevailed in such a contest on account of the condition of Hurry's limbs, but the instant the gun went off, the latter yielded and stumped towards the house, raising his legs at each step quite a foot from the ground, from an uncertainty of the actual position of his feet. But he had been anticipated by Judith. The whole stock of Hutter's arms, which had been left in the building as a resource in the event of a sudden outbreaking of hostilities, had been removed, and were already secreted, agreeably to Deerslayer's directions. In consequence of this precaution, no means offered by which March could put his designs in execution. Hurry seated himself, and like Hutter, for half an hour he was too much occupied in endeavoring to restore the circulation, and in regaining the use of his limbs, to indulge in any other reflections. By the end of this time the raft had disappeared, and night was beginning to throw her shadows once more over the whole sylvan scene. Before darkness had completely set in, and while the girls were preparing the evening meal, Deerslayer related to Hutter an outline of events that had taken place, and gave him a history of the means he had adopted for the security of his children and property. Chapter 14. Recording by Bill Borst. Chapter 15 of the Deerslayer. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Deerslayer, by James Fenimore Cooper. Chapter 15. As long as Edwarda rules this lande, nequiet you wile ye kno. Your sonnes and husbandes shall be slain, and brooks with bloode shall flowa. You leave your a god and lawful king, when in adversity. Likame and toa the true causa steek, and for the true causa dia. Chatterton. The calm of evening was again in singular contrast, while its gathering gloom was in singular unison with the passions of men. The sun was set, and the rays of the retiring luminary had ceased to gild the edges of the few clouds that had sufficient openings to admit the passage of its fading light. The canopy overhead was heavy and dense, promising another night of darkness, but the surface of the lake was scarcely disturbed by a ripple. There was a little air, though it scarce deserved to be termed wind. Still, being damp and heavy, it had a certain force. The party in the castle were as gloomy and silent as the scene. The two ransomed prisoners felt humbled and discolored, but their humility partook of the rancor of revenge. They were far more disposed to remember the indignity with which they had been treated during the last few hours of their captivity, than to feel grateful for the previous indulgence. Then that keen-sighted monitor, conscience, by reminding them of the retributive justice of all they had endured, goaded them rather to turn the tables on their enemies than to accuse themselves. As for the others, they were thoughtful, equally from regret and joy. Deerslayer and Judith felt most of the former sensation, though from very different causes, while Hetty, for the moment, was perfectly happy. The Delaware had also lively pictures of felicity in the prospect of so soon regaining his betrothed. Under such circumstances, and in this mood, all were taking the evening meal. "Old Tom," cried Hurry, bursting into a fit of boisterous laughter, "you looked amazingly like a tethered bear as you was stretched on them hemlock boughs, and I only wonder you didn't growl more. Well, it's over, and syths and lamentations won't mend the matter. There's the blackguard Rivenoak, he that brought us off has an uncommon scalp, and I'd give as much for it myself as the colony. Yes, I feel as rich as the governor in these matters now, and will lay down with them doubloon for doubloon. Judith, darling, did you mourn for me much, when I was in the hands of the Philipsteins?" The last were a family of German descent on the Mohawk, to whom Hurry had a great antipathy, and whom he had confounded with the enemies of Judea. "Our tears have raised the lake, Hurry March, as you might have seen by the shore," returned Judith, with a feigned levity that she was far from feeling. "That Hetty and I should have grieved for father was to be expected, but we fairly rained tears for you." "We were sorry for poor Hurry, as well as for father, Judith," put in her innocent and unconscious sister. "True, girl, true; but we feel sorrow for everybody that's in trouble, you know," returned the other, in a quick, admonitory manner, and a low tone. "Nevertheless, we are glad to see you, Master March, and out of the hands of the Philipsteins, too." "Yes, they're a bad set, and so is the other brood of 'em down on the river. It's a wonderment to me how you got us off, Deerslayer, and I forgive you the interference that prevented my doin' justice on that vagabond for this small service. Let us into the secret, that we may do you the same turn, at need. Was it by lying, or by coaxing?" "By neither, Hurry, but by buying. We paid a ransom for you both, and that, too, at a price so high you would well be on your guard ag'in another captivement, lest our stock of goods shouldn't hold out." "A ransom! Old Tom has paid the fiddler, then, for nothing of mine would have bought off the hair, much less the skin. I didn't think men as keen set as them vagabonds would let a fellow up so easy, when they had him fairly at a close hug, and floored. But money is money, and somehow it's unnatural hard to withstand. Indian or white man, 'tis pretty much the same. It must be owned, Judith, there's a considerable of human natur' in mankind ginirally, arter all." Hutter now rose, and signing to Deerslayer, as he led him to an inner room, where, in answer to his questions, he first learned the price that had been paid for his release. The old man expressed neither resentment nor surprise at the inroad that had been made on his chest, though he did manifest some curiosity to know how far the investigations of its contents had been carried. He also inquired where the key had been found. The habitual frankness of Deerslayer prevented any prevarication, and the conference soon terminated by the return of the two to the outer room, or that which served for the double purpose of parlor and kitchen. "I wonder if it's peace or war between us and the savages!" exclaimed Hurry, just as Deerslayer, who had paused for a single instant, listened attentively, and was passing through the outer door without stopping. "This giving up captives has a friendly look, and when men have traded together on a fair and honorable footing, they ought to part fri'nds, for that occasion at least. Come back, Deerslayer, and let us have your judgment, for I'm beginning to think more of you since your late behavior than I used to do." "There's an answer to your question, Hurry, since you're in such haste to come ag'in to blows." As Deerslayer spoke, he threw on the table, on which the other was reclining with one elbow, a sort of miniature faggot, composed of a dozen sticks, bound tightly together with a deerskin thong. March seized it eagerly, and holding it close to a blazing knot of pine that lay on the hearth, and which gave out all the light there was in the room, ascertained that the ends of the several sticks had been dipped in blood. "If this isn't plain English," said the reckless frontier man, "it's plain Indian. Here's what they call a declaration of war down at York, Judith. How did you come by this defiance, Deerslayer?" "Fairly enough. It lay not a minute since, in what you call Floatin' Tom's door yard." "How came it there?" "It never fell from the clouds, Judith, as little toads sometimes do, and then it don't rain." "You must prove where it come from, Deerslayer, or we shall suspect some design to skear them that would have lost their wits long ago, if fear could drive 'em away." Deerslayer had approached a window, and cast a glance out of it on the dark aspect of the lake. As if satisfied with what he beheld, he drew near Hurry, and took the bundle of sticks into his own hand, examining it attentively. "Yes, this is an Indian declaration of war, sure enough," he said, "and it's a proof how little you're suited to be on the path it has travelled, Harry March, that it has got here, and you never the wiser as to the means. The savages may have left the scalp on your head, but they must have taken off the ears, else you'd have heard the stirring of the water made by the lad as he come off again on his two logs. His ar'n'd was to throw these sticks at our door, as much as to say, We've struck the war-post since the trade, and the next thing will be to strike you. The prowling wolves, but hand me that rifle, Judith, and I'll send an answer back to the vagabonds through their messenger." "Not while I stand by, Master March," coolly put in Deerslayer, motioning for the other to forbear. "Faith is faith, whether given to a red-skin or to a Christian. The lad lighted a knot, and came off fairly under its blaze to give us this warning, and no man here should harm him while employed on such an ar'n'd. There's no use in words, for the boy is too cunning to leave the knot burning, now his business is done, and the night is already too dark for a rifle to have any sartainty." "That may be true enough as to a gun, but there's virtue still in a canoe," answered Hurry, passing towards the door with enormous strides, carrying a rifle in his hands. "The being doesn't live that shall stop me from following and bringing back that riptyle's scalp. The more on 'em that you crush in the egg, the fewer there'll be to dart at you in the woods." Judith trembled like the aspen. She scarce knew why herself, though there was the prospect of a scene of violence. For if Hurry was fierce and overbearing in the consciousness of his vast strength, Deerslayer had about him the calm determination that promises greater perseverance, and a resolution more likely to effect its object. It was the stern, resolute eye of the latter, rather than the noisy vehemence of the first, that excited her apprehensions. Hurry soon reached the spot where the canoe was fastened, but not before Deerslayer had spoken in a quick, earnest voice to the Serpent, in Delaware. The latter had been the first, in truth, to hear the sounds of the oars, and he had gone upon the platform in jealous watchfulness. The light satisfied him that a message was coming, and when the boy cast his bundle of sticks at his feet, it neither moved his anger nor induced surprise. He merely stood at watch, rifle in hand, to make certain that no treachery lay behind the defiance. As Deerslayer now called to him, he stepped into the canoe, and quick as thought removed the paddles. Hurry was furious when he found that he was deprived of the means of proceeding. He first approached the Indian with loud menaces, and even Deerslayer stood aghast at the probable consequences. March shook his sledge-hammer fists, and flourished his arms as he drew near the Indian, and all expected he would attempt to fell the Delaware to the earth. One of them, at least, was well aware that such an experiment would be followed by immediate bloodshed. But even Hurry was awed by the stern composure of the chief, and he, too, knew that such a man was not to be outraged with impunity. He therefore turned to vent his rage on Deerslayer, where he foresaw no consequences so terrible. What might have been the result of this second demonstration, if completed, is unknown, since it was never made. "Hurry," said a gentle, soothing voice at his elbow, "it's wicked to be so angry, and God will not overlook it. The Iroquois treated you well, and they didn't take your scalp, though you and father wanted to take theirs." The influence of mildness on passion is well known. Hetty, too, had earned a sort of consideration, that had never before been enjoyed by her, through the self-devotion and decision of her recent conduct. Perhaps her established mental imbecility, by removing all distrust of a wish to control, aided her influence. Let the cause be as questionable as it might, the effect was sufficiently certain. Instead of throttling his old fellow-traveler, Hurry turned to the girl and poured out a portion of his discontent, if none of his anger, in her attentive ears. "'Tis too bad, Hetty," he exclaimed, "as bad as a county jail or a lack of beaver, to get a creature into your very trap, then to see it get off. As much as 6 first-quality skins, in valley, has paddled off on them clumsy logs, when 20 strokes of a well-turned paddle would overtake 'em. I say in valley, for as to the boy in the way of natur', he is only a boy, and is worth neither more nor less than one. Deerslayer, you've been untrue to your fri'nds, in letting such a chance slip through my fingers as well as your own." The answer was given quietly, but with a voice as steady as a fearless nature and the consciousness of rectitude could make it. "I should have been untrue to the right, had I done otherwise," returned the Deerslayer steadily, "and neither you nor any other man has the authority to demand that much of me. The lad came on a lawful business, and the meanest red-skin that roams the woods would be ashamed of not respecting his ar'n'd. But he's now far beyond your reach, Master March, and there's little use in talking, like a couple of women, of what can no longer be helped." So saying, Deerslayer turned away, like one resolved to waste no more words on the subject, while Hutter pulled Harry by the sleeve and led him into the Ark. There they sat long in private conference. In the meantime, the Indian and his friend had their secret consultation, for though it wanted some 3 or 4 hours to the rising of the star, the former could not abstain from canvassing his scheme, and from opening his heart to the other. Judith, too, yielded to her softer feelings, and listened to the whole of Hetty's artless narrative of what occurred after she landed. The woods had few terrors for either of these girls, educated as they had been, and accustomed as they were to look out daily at their rich expanse, or to wander beneath their dark shades. But the elder sister felt that she would have hesitated about thus venturing alone into an Iroquois camp. Concerning Hist, Hetty was not very communicative. She spoke of her kindness and gentleness, and of the meeting in the forest, but the secret of Chingachgook was guarded with a shrewdness and fidelity that many a sharper-witted girl might have failed to display. At length the several conferences were broken up by the reappearance of Hutter on the platform. Here he assembled the whole party, and communicated as much of his intentions as he deemed expedient. Of the arrangement made by Deerslayer, to abandon the castle during the night and to take refuge in the Ark, he entirely approved. It struck him, as it had the others, as the only effectual means of escaping destruction. Now that the savages had turned their attention to the construction of rafts, no doubt could exist of their at least making an attempt to carry the building, and the message of the bloody sticks sufficiently showed their confidence in their own success. In short, the old man viewed the night as critical, and he called on all to get ready as soon as possible, in order to abandon the dwellings, temporarily at least, if not forever. These communications made, everything proceeded promptly and with intelligence. The castle was secured in the manner already described, the canoes were withdrawn from the dock and fastened to the Ark by the side of the other, the few necessaries that had been left in the house were transferred to the cabin, the fire was extinguished, and all embarked. The vicinity of the hills, with their drapery of pines, had the effect to render nights that were obscure darker than common on the lake. As usual, however, a belt of comparative light was etched through the centre of the sheet, while it was within the shadows of the mountains that the gloom rested most heavily on the water. The island or castle stood in this belt of comparative light, but still the night was so dark as to cover the aperture of the Ark. At the distance of an observer on the shore, her movements could not be seen at all, more particularly as a background of dark hillside filled up the perspective of every view that was taken diagonally or directly across the water. The prevailing wind on the lakes of that region is west, but owing to the avenues performed by the mountains it is frequently impossible to tell the true direction of the currents, as they often vary within very short distances and brief differences of time. This is truer in light of fluctuating puffs of air than in steady breezes, though the squalls of even the latter are familiarly known to be uncertain and baffling in all mountainous regions and narrow waters. On the present occasion, Hutter himself, as he shoved the Ark from her berth at the side of the platform, was at a loss to pronounce which way the wind blew. In common, this difficulty was solved by the clouds, which, floating high above the hilltops, as a matter of course, obeyed the currents. But now the whole vault of heaven seemed a massive gloomy wall. Not an opening of any sort was visible, and Chingachgook was already trembling lest the non-appearance of the star might prevent his betrothed from being punctual to her appointment. Under these circumstances, Hutter hoisted his sail, seemingly with the sole intention of getting away from the castle, as it might be dangerous to remain much longer in its vicinity. The air soon filled the cloth, and when the scow was got under command, and the sail was properly trimmed, it was found that the direction was southerly, inclining towards the eastern shore. No better course offering for the purposes of the party, the singular craft was suffered to skim the surface of the water in this direction for more than an hour, when a change in the currents of the air drove them over towards the camp. Deerslayer watched all the movements of Hutter and Harry with jealous attention. At first he did not know whether to ascribe the course they held to accident or to design, but he now began to suspect the latter. Familiar as Hutter was with the lake, it was easy to deceive one who had little practice on the water, and let his intentions be what they might, it was evident, ere 2 hours had elapsed, that the Ark had got sufficient space to be within 100 rods of the shore. directly abreast of the known position of the camp. For a considerable time previously to reaching this point, Hurry, who had some knowledge of the Algonquin language, had been in close conference with the Indian, and the result was now announced by the latter to Deerslayer, who had been a cold, not to say distrusted, looker-on of all that passed. "My old father, and my young brother, the Big Pine," for so the Delaware had named March, "want to see Huron scalps at their belts," said Chingachgook to his friend. "There is room for some on the girdle of the Sarpent, and his people will look for them when he goes back to his village. Their eyes must not be left long in a fog, but they must see what they look for. I know that my brother has a white hand. He will not strike even the dead. He will wait for us. When we come back, he will not hide his face from shame for his friend. The Great Serpent of the Mohicans must be worthy to go on the war path with Hawkeye." "Ay, ay, Serpent, I see how it is. That name's to stick, and in time I shall get to be known by it instead of Deerslayer. Well, if such honors will come, the humblest of us all must be willing to abide by 'em. As for your looking for scalps, it belongs to your gifts, and I see no harm in it. Be marciful, Sarpent, howsever, be marciful, I beseech you. It surely can do no harm to a red skin's honor to show a little marcy. As for the old man, the father of 2 young women, who might ripen better feelin's in his heart, and Harry March, here, who, pine as he is, might better bear the fruit of a more Christianized tree, as for them 2, I leave them in the hands of the white man's God. Wasn't it for the bloody sticks, no man should go ag'in the Mingos this night, seeing that it would dishonor our faith and characters. But them that crave blood can't complain if blood is shed at their call. Still, Sarpent, you can be marciful. Don't begin your career with the wails of women and the cries of children. Bear yourself so that Hist will smile, and not weep, when she meets you. Go, then, and the Manitou presarve you. My brother will stay here with the scow. Wah will soon be standing on the shore waiting, and Chingachgook must hasten." The Indian then joined his 2 co-adventurers, and first lowering the sail, they all 3 entered the canoe, and left the side of the Ark. Neither Hutter nor March spoke to Deerslayer concerning their object, or the probable length of their absence. All this had been confided to the Indian, who had acquitted himself of the trust with characteristic brevity. As soon as the canoe was out of sight, and that occurred ere the paddles had given a dozen strokes, Deerslayer made the best dispositions he could to keep the Ark as nearly stationary as possible, and then he sat down in the end of the scow, to chew the cud of his own bitter reflections. It was not long, however, before he was joined by Judith, who sought every occasion to be near him, managing her attack on his affections with the address that was suggested by native coquetry, aided by no little practice, but which received much of its most dangerous power from the touch of feeling that threw around her manner, voice, accents, thoughts, and acts, the indescribable witchery of natural tenderness. Leaving the young hunter exposed to these dangerous assailants, it has become our more immediate business to follow the party in the canoe to the shore. The controlling influence that led Hutter and Hurry to repeat their experiment against the camp was precisely that which had induced the first attempt, a little heightened, perhaps, by the desire of revenge. But neither of these 2 rude beings, so ruthless in all things that touched the rights and interests of the red man, though possessing veins of human feeling on other matters, was much actuated by any other desire than a heartless longing for profit. Hurry had felt angered at his sufferings when first liberated, it is true, but that emotion soon disappeared in the habitual love of gold, which he sought with the reckless avidity of a needy spendthrift, rather than with the ceaseless longings of a miser. In short, the motive that urged them both so soon to go against the Hurons was an habitual contempt of their enemy, acting on the unceasing cupidity of prodigality. The additional chances of success, however, had their place in the formation of the second enterprise. It was known that a large portion of the warriors, perhaps all, were encamped for the night abreast of the castle, and it was hoped that the scalps of helpless victims would be the consequence. To confess the truth, Hutter in particular, he who had just left 2 daughters behind him, expected to find few besides women and children in the camp. The fact had been but slightly alluded to in his communications with Hurry, and with Chingachgook it had been kept entirely out of view. If the Indian thought of it at all, it was known only to himself. Hutter steered the canoe. Hurry had manfully taken his post in the bows, and Chingachgook stood in the centre. We say stood, for all three were so skilled in the management of that species of frail bark as to be able to keep erect positions in the midst of the darkness. The approach to the shore was made with great caution, and the landing effected in safety. The three now prepared their arms, and began their tiger-like approach upon the camp. The Indian was on the lead, his two companions treading in his footsteps with a stealthy cautiousness of manner that rendered their progress almost literally noiseless. Occasionally a dried twig snapped under the heavy weight of the gigantic Hurry, or the blundering clumsiness of the old man. But, had the Indian walked on air, his step could not have seemed lighter. The great object was first to discover the position of the fire, which was known to be the centre of the whole encampment. At length the keen eye of Chingachgook caught a glimpse of this important guide. It was glimmering at a distance among the trunks of trees. There was no blaze, but merely a single smouldering brand, as suited the hour, the savages usually retiring and rising with the revolutions of the sun. As soon as a view was obtained of this beacon, the progress of the adventurers became swifter and more certain. In a few minutes they got to the edge of the circle of little huts. Here they stopped to survey their ground, and to concert their movements. The darkness was so deep as to render it difficult to distinguish anything but the glowing brand, the trunks of the nearest trees, and the endless canopy of leaves that veiled the clouded heaven. It was ascertained, however, that a hut was quite near, and Chingachgook attempted to reconnoitre its interior. The manner in which the Indian approached the place that was supposed to contain enemies resembled the wily advances of the cat on the bird. As he drew near, he stooped to his hands and knees, for the entrance was so low as to require this attitude, even as a convenience. Before thrusting his head inside, however, he listened long to catch the breathing of sleepers. No sound was audible, and this human serpent thrust his head in at the door, or opening, as another serpent would have peered in on the nest. Nothing rewarded the hazardous experiment, for, after feeling cautiously with a hand, the place was found to be empty. The Delaware proceeded in the same guarded manner to one or two more of the huts, finding all in the same situation. He then returned to his companions, and informed them that the Hurons had deserted their camp. A little further inquiry corroborated this fact, and it only remained to return to the canoe. The different manner in which the adventurers bore the disappointment is worthy of a passing remark. The chief, who had landed solely with the hope of acquiring renown, stood stationary, leaning against a tree, waiting the pleasure of his companions. He was mortified, and a little surprised, it is true, but he bore all with dignity, falling back for support on the sweeter expectations that still lay in reserve for that evening. It was true, he could not now hope to meet his mistress with the proofs of his daring and skill on his person, but he might still hope to meet her, and the warrior, who was zealous in the search, might always hope to be honored. On the other hand, Hutter and Hurry, who had been chiefly instigated by the basest of all human motives, the thirst of gain, could scarce control their feelings. They went prowling among the huts, as if they expected to find some forgotten child, or careless sleeper, and again did they vent their spite on the insensible huts, several of which were actually torn to pieces, and scattered about the place. Nay, they even quarrelled with each other, and fierce reproaches passed between them. It is possible some serious consequences might have occurred, had not the Delaware interfered to remind them of the danger of being so unguarded, and of the necessity of returning to the Ark. This checked the dispute, and in a few minutes they were paddling sullenly back to the spot where they hoped to find that vessel. It has been said that Judith took her place at the side of Deerslayer, soon after the adventurers departed. For a short time the girl was silent, and the hunter was ignorant which of the sisters had approached him, but he soon recognized the rich, full-spirited voice of the elder, as her feelings escaped in words. "This is a terrible life for women, Deerslayer," she exclaimed. "Would to heaven I could see an end of it!" "The life is well enough, Judith," was the answer, "being pretty much as it is used or abused. What would you wish to see in its place?" "I should be 1,000 times happier to live nearer to civilized beings. where there are farms and churches, and houses built as it might be by Christian hands, and where my sleep at night would be sweet and tranquil. A dwelling near one of the forts would be far better than this dreary place where we live." "Nay, Judith, I can't agree too lightly in the truth of all this. If forts are good to keep off enemies, they sometimes hold enemies of their own. I don't think 'twould be for your good, or the good of Hetty, to live near one. And if I must say what I think, I'm afeard you are a little too near as it is." Deerslayer went on in his own steady, earnest manner, for the darkness concealed the tints that colored the cheeks of the girl almost to the brightness of crimson, while her own great efforts suppressed the sounds of the breathing that nearly choked her. "As for farms, they have their uses, and there's them that like to pass their lives on 'em. But what comfort can a man look for in a clearin', that he can't find in double quantities in the forest? If air, and room, and light are a little craved, the windrows and the streams will furnish 'em, or here are the lakes for such as have bigger longings in that way. But where are you to find your shades, and laughing springs, and leaping brooks, and venerable trees 1,000 years old, in a clearin'? You don't find them, but you find their disabled trunks marking the 'arth like headstones in a graveyard. It seems to me that the people who live in such places must be always thinkin' of their own inds, and of universal decay, and that, too, not of the decay that is brought about by time and nature, but the decay that follows waste and violence. Then as to churches, they're good, I suppose, else wouldn't good men uphold 'em, but they are not altogether necessary. They call 'em the temples of the Lord, but, Judith, the whole 'arth is a temple of the Lord to such as have the right mind. Neither forts nor churches make people happier of themselves. Moreover, all is contradiction in the settlements, while all is concord in the woods. Forts and churches almost always go together, and yet they're downright contradictions, churches being for peace, and forts for war. No, no. Give me the strong places of the wilderness, which is the trees, and the churches, too, which are arbors raised by the hand of nature. Woman is not made for scenes like these, Deerslayer, scenes of which we shall have no end, as long as this war lasts. If you mean women of white color, I rather think you're not far from the truth, gal. But as for the females of the red men, such visitations are quite in character. Nothing would make Hist, now, the bargained wife of yonder Delaware, happier than to know that he is at this moment prowling around his natural enemies, striving after a scalp. Surely, surely, Deerslayer, she cannot be a woman, and not feel concern when she thinks the man she loves is in danger. She doesn't think of the danger, Judith, but of the honor. And when the heart is desperately set on such feelin's, why, there is little room to crowd in fear. Hist is a kind, gentle, laughing, pleasant creature, but she loves honor, as well as any Delaware gal I ever knowed. She's to meet the Sarpent an hour hence, on the p'int where Hetty landed, and no doubt she has her anxiety about it, like any other woman, but she'd be all the happier did she know that her lover was at this moment waylaying a Mingo for his scalp. If you really believe this, Deerslayer, no wonder you lay so much stress on gifts. Certain am I, that no white girl could feel anything but misery while she believed her betrothed in danger of his life. Nor do I suppose even you, unmoved and calm as you ever seem to be, could be at peace if you believed your Hist in danger. That's a different matter. 'Tis altogether a different matter, Judith. Woman is too weak and gentle to be intended to run such risks, and man must feel for her. Yes, I rather think that's as much red nature as it's white. But I have no Hist, nor am I like to have, for I hold it wrong to mix colors, any way except in friendship and sarvices. In that you are and feel as a white man should. As for Hurry Harry, I do think it would be all the same to him whether his wife were a squaw or a governor's daughter, provided she was a little comely, and could help to keep his craving stomach full. You do March injustice, Judith. Yes, you do. The poor fellow dotes on you, and when a man has ra'ally set his heart on such a creature, it isn't a Mingo, or even a Delaware gal, that'll be likely to unsettle his mind. You may laugh at such men as Hurry and I, for we're rough and unteached in the ways of books and other knowledge, But we've our good p'ints as well as our bad ones. An honest heart is not to be despised, gal, even though it be not versed in all the niceties that please the female fancy. You, Deerslayer, and do you, can you, for an instant, suppose I place you by the side of Harry March? No, no, I am not so far gone in dullness as that. No one, man or woman, could think of naming your honest heart, manly nature, and simple truth, with the boisterous selfishness, greedy avarice, and overbearing ferocity of Harry March. The very best that can be said of him is to be found in his name of Hurry Skurry, which, if it means no great harm, means no great good. Even my father, following his feelings with the other, as he is doing at this moment, well knows the difference between you. This I know, for he said as much to me in plain language." Judith was a girl of quick sensibilities and of impetuous feelings, and, being under few of the restraints that curtail the manifestations of maiden emotions among those who are educated in the habits of civilized life, she sometimes betrayed the latter with a feeling that was so purely natural as to place it as far above the wiles of coquetry as it was superior to its heartlessness. She had now even taken one of the hard hands of the hunter and pressed it between both her own, with a warmth and earnestness that proved how sincere was her language. It was perhaps fortunate that she was checked by the very excess of her feelings, since the same power might have urged her on to avow all that her father had said. The old man not having been satisfied with making a comparison favorable to Deerslayer, as between the hunter and Hurry, but having actually, in his blunt, rough way, briefly advised his daughter to cast off the latter entirely, and to think of the former as a husband. Judith would not willingly have said this to any other man, but there was so much confidence awakened by the guileless simplicity of Deerslayer, that one of her nature found it a constant temptation to overstep the bounds of habit. She went no further, however, immediately relinquishing the hand, and falling back on a reserve that was more suited to her sex, and indeed to her natural modesty. "Thankee, Judith, thankee with all my heart," returned the hunter, whose humility prevented him from placing any flattering interpretation on either the conduct or the language of the girl. "Thankee as much as if it was all true. Harry's sightly, yes, he's as sightly as the tallest pine of the mountains, and the Sarpent has named him accordingly. However, some fancy good looks, and some fancy good conduct only. Hurry has one advantage, and it depends on himself whether he'll have t'other, or Hark! That's your father's voice, gal, and he speaks like a man who's riled at something." "God save us from any more of these horrible scenes!" exclaimed Judith, bending her face to her knees, and endeavoring to exclude the discordant sounds by applying her hands to her ears. "I sometimes wish I had no father." This was bitterly said, and the repinings which extorted the words were bitterly felt. It is impossible to say what might next have escaped her had not a gentle, low voice spoken at her elbow. "Judith, I ought to have read a chapter to father and Hurry," said the innocent but terrified speaker, "and that would have kept them from going again on such an errand. Do you call to them, Deerslayer, and tell them I want them, and that it will be good for them both if they'll return and hearken to my words." "Ahs me! Poor Hetty, you little know the cravens for gold and revenge, if you believe they are so easily turned aside from their longin's. But this is an uncommon business in more ways than one, Judith. I hear your father and Hurry growling like bears, and yet no noise comes from the mouth of the young chief. There's an end of secrecy, and yet his whoop, which ought to ring in the mountains, according to rule in such circumstances, is silent. Justice may have alighted on him, and his death have saved the lives of the innocent." "Not it, not it. The Sarpent is not the one to suffer, if that's to be the law. Sartainly there has been no onset, and 'tis most likely that the camp's deserted, and the men are comin' back disapp'inted. That accounts for the growls of Hurry, and the silence of the Sarpent." Just at this instant a fall of a paddle was heard in the canoe. For vexation made March reckless, Deerslayer felt convinced that his conjecture was true. The sail being down, the ark had not drifted far, and ere many minutes he heard Chingachgook, in a low, quiet tone, directing Hutter how to steer in order to reach it. In less time than it takes to tell the fact, the canoe touched the scow, and the adventurers entered the latter. Neither Hutter nor Hurry spoke of what had occurred, but the Delaware, in passing his friend, merely uttered the words, "Fire's out," which, if not literally true, sufficiently explained the truth to his listener. It was now a question as to the course to be steered. A short surly conference was held, when Hutter decided that the wisest way would be to keep in motion as the means most likely to defeat any attempt at a surprise, announcing his own and March's intention to requite themselves for the loss of sleep during their captivity by lying down. As the air still baffled and continued light, it was finally determined to sail before it, let it come in what direction it might, so long as it did not blow the Ark upon the strand. This point settled, the released prisoners helped to hoist the sail, and they threw themselves upon two of the pallets, leaving Deerslayer and his friend to look after the movements of the craft. As neither of the latter was disposed to sleep, on account of the appointment with Hist, this arrangement was acceptable to all parties. That Judith and Hetty remained up also, in no manner impaired the agreeable features of this change. For some time the scow rather drifted than sailed along the western shore, following a light southerly current of the air. The progress was slow, not exceeding a couple of miles in the hour, but the two men perceived that it was not only carrying them towards the point they desired to reach, but at a rate that was quite as fast as the hour yet rendered necessary. But little more was to be said the while, even by the girls, and that little had more reference to the rescue of Hist than to any other subject. The Indian was calm to the eye, but as minute after minute passed, his feelings became more and more excited, until they reached a state that might have satisfied the demands of even the most exacting mistress. Deerslayer kept the craft as much in the bays as was prudent, for the double purpose of sailing within the shadows of the woods, and of detecting any signs of an encampment they might pass on the shore. In this manner they doubled one low point, and were already in the bay that was terminated north by the goal at which they aimed. The latter was still a quarter of a mile distant, when Chingachgook came silently to the side of his friend, and pointed to a place directly ahead. A small fire was glimmering just within the verge of the bushes that lined the shore on the southern side of the point, leaving no doubt that the Indians had suddenly removed their camp to the very place, or at least the very projection of land, where Hist had given them the rendezvous. End of chapter 15. Recording by Bill Borst. Chapter 16 of the Deerslayer. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Deerslayer, by James Fenimore Cooper. Chapter 16. I hear thee babbling to the vale of sunshine and of flowers, but unto me thou bring'st a tale of visionary hours. Wordsworth. One discovery mentioned at the close of the preceding chapter was of great moment in the eyes of Deerslayer and his friend. In the first place, there was the danger, almost the certainty, that Hutter and Hurry would make a fresh attempt on this camp, should they awake and ascertain its position. Then there was the increased risk of landing to bring off Hist, and there were the general uncertainty and additional hazards that must follow from the circumstance that their enemies had begun to change their positions. As the Delaware was aware that the hour was near when he ought to repair to the rendezvous, he no longer thought of trophies torn from his foes, and one of the first things arranged between him and his associate was to permit the two others to sleep on, lest they should disturb the execution of their plans by substituting some of their own. The Ark moved slowly, and it would have taken fully a quarter of an hour to reach the point, at the rate at which they were going, thus affording time for a little forethought. The Indians, in the wish to conceal their fire from those who were thought to be still in the castle, had placed it so near the southern side of the point as to render it extremely difficult to shut it in by the bushes, though Deerslayer varied the direction of the scow both to the right and to the left, in the hope of being able to effect that object. "There's one advantage, Judith, in finding that fire so near the water," he said, while executing these little manoeuvres, "since it shows the Mingos believe we are in the hut, and our coming on 'em from this quarter will be an unlooked-for event. But it's lucky Harry March and your father are asleep, else we should have 'em prowling after scalps again. Ha! There! The bushes are beginning to shut in the fire, and now it can't be seen at all." Deerslayer waited a little to make sure that he had at last gained the desired position, when he gave the signal agreed on, and Chingachgook let go the grapnel and lowered the sail. The situation in which the ark now lay had its advantages and its disadvantages. The fire had been hid by sheering towards the shore, and the latter was nearer perhaps than was desirable. Still, the water was known to be very deep farther off in the lake, and anchoring in deep water, under the circumstances in which the party was placed, was to be avoided, if possible. It was also believed no raft could be within miles, and though the trees in the darkness appeared almost to overhang the scow, it would not be easy to get off to her without using a boat. The intense darkness that prevailed so close in with the forest, too, served as an effectual screen, and so long as care was had not to make a noise, there was little or no danger of being detected. All these things Deerslayer pointed out to Judith, instructing her as to the course she was to follow in the event of an alarm, for it was thought to the last degree inexpedient to arouse the sleepers, unless it might be in the greatest emergency. "And now, Judith, we understand one another. It is time the Sarpent and I had taken to the canoe," the hunter concluded. "The star has not risen yet, it's true, but it soon must, though none of us are likely to be any the wiser for it tonight, on account of the clouds. Howsever, Hist has a ready mind, and she's one of them that doesn't always need to have a thing afore her to see it. I'll warrant you she'll not be either 2 minutes or 2 feet out of the way, unless them jealous vagabonds, the Mingos, have taken the alarm, and put her as a stool-pigeon to catch us, or have hid her away, in order to prepare her mind for a Huron instead of a Mohican husband." "Deerslayer," interrupted the girl, earnestly, "this is a most dangerous service. Why do you go on it at all?" "Anan?" "Why, you know, gal, we go to bring off Hist, the Sarpent's betrothed, the maid he means to marry, as soon as we get back to the tribe." "That is all right for the Indian, but you do not mean to marry Hist. You are not betrothed, and why should two risk their lives and liberties to do that which one can just as well perform?" "Ah, now I understand you, Judith. Yes, now I begin to take the idee. You think as Hist is the Sarpent's betrothed, as they call it, and not mine, it's altogether his affair, and as one man can paddle a canoe, he ought to be left to go after his gal alone. But you forget this is our ar'n'd here on the lake, and it would not tell well to forget an ar'n'd just as the pinch came. Then, if love does count for so much with some people, particularly with young women, friendship counts for something, too, with other some. I dares to say, the Delaware can paddle a canoe by himself, and can bring off Hist by himself, and perhaps he would like that quite as well, as to have me with him. But he couldn't sarcumvent sarcumventions, or stir up an ambushment, or fight with the savages, and get his sweetheart at the same time, as well by himself as if he had a friend with him to depend on, even if that friend is no better than myself. No, no, Judith, you wouldn't desert one that counted on you at such a moment, and you can't in reason expect me to do it." I believe you are right, Deerslayer, and yet I wish you were not to go. Promise me one thing at least, and that is, not to trust yourself among the savages, or to do anything more than to save the girl. That will be enough for once, and with that you ought to be satisfied." "Lord bless you, gal, one would think it's Hetty that's talking, and not the quick-witted and wonderful Judith Hutter. But fright makes the wise silly, and the strong weak. Yes, I've seen proofs of that, time and again. Well, it's kind and soft-hearted of you, Judith, to feel this consarn for a fellow creature, and I shall always say that you are kind and of true feelings, let them that envy your good looks tell as many idle stories of you as they may." "Deerslayer," hastily said the girl, interrupting him, though nearly choked by her own emotions, "do you believe all you hear about a poor motherless girl? Is the foul tongue of Hurry Harry to blast my life?" "Not it, Judith, not it. I've told Hurry it wasn't manful to backbite them he couldn't win by fair means, and that even an Indian is always tender touching a young woman's good name." "If I had a brother, he wouldn't dare to do it!" exclaimed Judith, with eyes flashing fire. "But, finding me without any protector but an old man, whose ears are getting to be as dull as his feelings, he has his way as he pleases." "Not exactly that, Judith; no, not exactly that, neither. No man, brother or stranger, would stand by and see as fair a gal as yourself hunted down, without saying a word in her behalf. Hurry's in arnest in wanting to make you his wife, and the little he does let out ag'in you comes more from jealousy, like, than from anything else. Smile on him when he awakes, and squeeze his hand only half as hard as you squeezed mine a bit ago, and my life on it, the poor fellow will forget everything but your comeliness. Hot words don't always come from the heart, but oftener from the stomach than anywhere else. Try him, Judith, when he awakes, and see the virtue of a smile." Deerslayer laughed in his own manner as he concluded, and then he intimated to the patient-looking but really impatient Chingachgook his readiness to proceed. As the young man entered the canoe, the girl stood immovable as stone, lost in the musings that the language and manner of the other were likely to produce. The simplicity of the hunter had completely put her at fault, for, in her narrow sphere, Judith was an expert manager of the other sex, though in the present instance she was far more actuated by impulses, in all she had said and done, than by calculation. We shall not deny that some of Judith's reflections were bitter, though the sequel of the tale must be referred to in order to explain how merited, or how keen were her sufferings. Chingachgook and his pale-faced friend set forth on their hazardous and delicate enterprise, with a coolness and method that would have done credit to men who were on their 20th instead of being on their first warpath. As suited his relation to the pretty fugitive in whose service they were engaged, the Indian took his place in the head of the canoe, while Deerslayer guided its movements in the stern. By this arrangement, the former would be the first to land, and of course the first to meet his mistress. The latter had taken his post without comment, but in secret influenced by the reflection that one who had so much at stake as the Indian might not possibly guide the canoe with the same steadiness and intelligence as another who had more command of his feelings. From the instant they left the side of the ark, the movements of the two adventurers were like the manoeuvres of highly drilled soldiers, who for the first time were called on to meet the enemy in the field. As yet, Chingachgook had never fired a shot in anger, and the debut of his companion in warfare is known to the reader. It is true, the Indian had been hanging about his enemy's camp for a few hours, on his first arrival, and he had even once entered it, as related in the last chapter. But no consequences had followed either experiment. Now, it was certain that an important result was to be effected, or a mortifying failure was to ensue. The rescue, or the continued captivity of Hist, depended on the enterprise. In a word, it was virtually the maiden expedition of these two ambitious young forest soldiers, and while one of them set forth impelled by sentiments that usually carry men so far, both had all their feelings of pride and manhood enlisted in their success. Instead of steering in a direct line to the point, then distant from the ark less than a quarter of a mile, Deerslayer laid the head of his canoe diagonally towards the centre of the lake, with a view to obtain a position from which he might approach the shore, having his enemies in his front only. The spot where Hetty had landed, and where Hist had promised to meet them, moreover, was on the upper side of the projection rather than on the lower, and to reach it would have required the two adventurers to double nearly the whole point, close in with the shore, had not this preliminary step been taken. So well was the necessity for this measure understood, that Chingachgook quietly paddled on, although it was adopted without consulting him, and apparently was taking him in a direction nearly opposite to that one might think he most wished to go. A few minutes sufficed, however, to carry the canoe the necessary distance, when both the young men ceased paddling, as it were, by instinctive consent, and the boat became stationary. The darkness increased rather than diminished, but it was still possible, from the place where the adventurers lay, to distinguish the outlines of the mountains. In vain did the Delaware turn his head eastward to catch a glimpse of the promised star, for notwithstanding the clouds broke a little near the horizon in that quarter of the heavens, the curtain continued so far drawn as effectually to conceal all behind it. In front, as was known by the formation of land above and behind it, lay the point, at the distance of about 1,000 feet. No signs of the castle could be seen, nor could any movement in that quarter of the lake reach the ear. The latter circumstance might have been equally owing to the distance, which was several miles, or to the fact that nothing was in motion. As for the ark, though scarcely farther from the canoe than the point, it lay so completely buried in the shadows of the shore that it would not have been visible even had there been many degrees more of light than actually existed. The adventurers now held a conference in low voices, consulting together as to the probable time. Deerslayer thought it wanted yet some minutes to the rising of the star, while the impatience of the chief caused him to fancy the night further advanced, and to believe that his betrothed was already waiting his appearance on the shore. As might have been expected, the opinion of the latter prevailed, and his friend disposed himself to steer for the place of rendezvous. The utmost skill and precaution now became necessary in the management of the canoe. The paddles were lifted and returned to the water in a noiseless manner, and when within 100 yards of the beach, Chingachgook took in his, altogether laying his hand on his rifle in its stead. As they got still more within the belt of darkness that girded the woods, it was seen that they were steering too far north, and the course was altered accordingly. The canoe now seemed to move by instinct, so cautious and deliberate were all its motions. Still it continued to advance, until its bows grated on the gravel of the beach, at the precise spot where Hetty had landed, and whence her voice had issued, the previous night, as the ark was passing. There was, as usual, a narrow strand, but bushes fringed the woods, and in most places overhung the water. Chingachgook stepped upon the beach, and cautiously examined it for some distance on each side of the canoe. In order to do this he was often obliged to wade to his knees in the lake, but no Hist rewarded his search. When he returned, he found his friend also on the shore. They next conferred in whispers, the Indian apprehending that they must have mistaken the place of rendezvous. But Deerslayer thought it was probable they had mistaken the hour. While he was yet speaking, he grasped the arm of the Delaware, caused him to turn his head in the direction of the lake, and pointed towards the summits of the eastern mountains. The clouds had broken a little, apparently behind rather than above the hills, and the evening star was glittering among the branches of a pine. This was every way a flattering omen, and the young men leaned on their rifles, listening intently for the sound of approaching footsteps. Voices they often heard, and mingled with them were the suppressed cries of children, and the low but sweet laugh of Indian women. As the native Americans are habitually cautious, and seldom break out in loud conversation, the adventurers knew by these facts that they must be very near the encampment. It was easy to perceive that there was a fire within the woods, by the manner in which some of the upper branches of the trees were illuminated, but it was not possible, where they stood, to ascertain exactly how near it was to themselves. Once or twice it seemed as if stragglers from around the fire were approaching the place of rendezvous, but these sounds were either altogether illusion, or those who had drawn near returned again without coming to the shore. A quarter of an hour was passed in this state of intense expectation and anxiety, when Deerslayer proposed that they should circle the point in the canoe, and by getting a position close in, where the camp could be seen, reconnoitre the Indians, and thus enable themselves to form some plausible conjectures for the non-appearance of Hist. The Delaware, however, resolutely refused to quit the spot, reasonably enough offering as a reason the disappointment of the girl, should she arrive in his absence. Deerslayer felt for his friend's concern, and offered to make the circuit of the point by himself, leaving the latter concealed in the bushes to await the occurrence of any fortunate event that might favor his views. With this understanding, then, the parties separated. As soon as Deerslayer was at his post again in the stern of the canoe, he left the shore with the same precautions, and in the same noiseless manner as he had approached it. On this occasion he did not go far from the land, the bushes affording a sufficient cover by keeping as close in as possible. Indeed, it would not have been easy to devise any means more favorable to reconnoitering round an Indian camp than those afforded by the actual state of things. The formation of the point permitted the place to be circled on 3 of its sides, and the progress of the boat was so noiseless as to remove any apprehensions from an alarm through sound. The most practised and guarded foot might stir a bunch of leaves or snap a dried stick in the dark, but a bark canoe could be made to float over the surface of smooth water, almost with the instinctive readiness, and certainly with the noiseless movements of an aquatic bird. Deerslayer had got nearly in a line between the camp and the ark before he caught a glimpse of the fire. This came upon him suddenly, and a little unexpectedly, at first causing an alarm, lest he had incautiously ventured within the circle of light it cast. But perceiving at a second glance that he was certainly safe from detection, so long as the Indians kept near the centre of the illumination, he brought the canoe to a state of rest in the most favorable position he could find, and commenced his observations. We have written much, but in vain, concerning this extraordinary being, if the reader requires now to be told, that untutored as he was in the learning of the world, and simple as he ever showed himself to be in all matters touching the subtleties of conventional taste, he was a man of strong, native, poetical feeling. He loved the woods for their freshness, their sublime solitudes, their vastness, and the impress that they everywhere bore of the divine hand of their Creator. He seldom moved through them without pausing to dwell on some peculiar beauty that gave him pleasure, though seldom attempting to investigate the causes, and never did a day pass without his communing in spirit, and this, too, without the aid of forms or language, with the infinite source of all he saw, felt, and beheld. Thus constituted, in a moral sense, and of a steadiness that no danger could appall, or any crisis disturb, it is not surprising that the hunter felt a pleasure at looking on the scene he now beheld, that momentarily caused him to forget the object of his visit. This will more fully appear when we describe it. The canoe lay in front of a natural vista, not only through the bushes that lined the shore, but of the trees also that afforded a clear view of the camp. It was by means of this same opening that the light had been first seen from the ark. In consequence of their recent change of ground, the Indians had not yet retired to their huts, but had been delayed by their preparations, which included lodging as well as food. A large fire had been made, as much to answer the purpose of torches as for the use of their simple cookery, and at this precise moment it was blazing high and bright, having recently received a large supply of dried brush. The effect was to illuminate the arches of the forest, and to render the whole area occupied by the camp as light as if hundreds of tapers were burning. Most of the toil had ceased, and even the hungriest child had satisfied its appetite. In a word, the time was that moment of relaxation and general indolence which is apt to succeed a hearty meal, and when the labors of the day have ended. The hunters and the fishermen had been totally successful, and food, that one great requisite of savage life, being abundant, every other care appeared to have subsided in the sense of enjoyment dependent on this all-important fact. Deerslayer saw at a glance that many of the warriors were absent. His acquaintance Rivenoak, however, was present, being seated in the foreground of a picture that Salvator Rosa would have delighted to draw, his swarthy features illuminated as much by pleasure as by the torch-like flame, while he showed another of the tribe one of the elephants that had caused so much sensation among his people. A boy was looking over his shoulder, in dull curiosity, completing the group. More in the background, 8 or 10 warriors lay half recumbent on the ground, or sat with their backs reclining against trees, so many types of indolent repose. Their arms were near them all, sometimes leaning against the same trees as themselves, or were lying across their bodies in careless preparation. But the group that most attracted the attention of Deerslayer was that composed of the women and children. All the females appeared to be collected together, and almost as a matter of course, their young were near them. The former laughed and chatted in their rebuked and quiet manner, though one who knew the habits of the people might have detected that everything was not going on in its usual train. Most of the young women seemed to be light-hearted enough, but one old hag was seated apart with a watchful, soured aspect, which the hunter at once knew betokened that some duty of an unpleasant character had been assigned her by the chiefs. What that duty was he had no means of knowing, but he felt satisfied it must be in some measure connected with her own sex, the aged among the women generally being chosen for such offices and no other. As a matter of course, Deerslayer looked eagerly and anxiously for the form of Hist, She was nowhere visible, though the light penetrated to considerable distances in all directions around the fire. Once or twice he started, as he thought he recognized her laugh, but his ears were deceived by the soft melody that is so common to the Indian female voice. At length the old woman spoke loud and angrily, and then he caught a glimpse of one or two dark figures in the background of trees, which turned as if obedient to the rebuke, and walked more within the circle of the light. A young warrior's form first came fairly into view, then followed by two youthful females, one of whom proved to be the Delaware girl. Deerslayer now comprehended it all. Hist was watched, possibly by her young companion, certainly by the old woman. The youth was probably some suitor of either her or her companion, but even his discretion was distrusted under the influence of his admiration. The known vicinity of those who might be supposed to be her friends, and the arrival of a strange red man on the lake had induced more than the usual care, and the girl had not been able to slip away from those who watched her, in order to keep her appointment. Deerslayer traced her uneasiness by her attempting once or twice to look up through the branches of the trees, as if endeavoring to get glimpses of the star she had herself named as the sign for meeting. All was vain, however, and after strolling about the camp a little longer, in affected indifference, the two girls quitted their male escort, and took seats among their own sex. As soon as this was done, the old sentinel changed her place to one more agreeable to herself, a certain proof that she had hitherto been exclusively on watch. Deerslayer now felt greatly at a loss how to proceed. He well knew that Chingachgook could never be persuaded to return to the Ark without making some desperate effort for the recovery of his mistress, and his own generous feelings well disposed him to aid in such an undertaking. He thought he saw the signs of an intention among the females to retire for the night, and should he remain, and the fire continue to give out its light, he might discover the particular hut or arbor under which Hist reposed, a circumstance that would be of infinite use in their future proceedings. Should he remain, however, much longer where he was, there was great danger that the impatience of his friend would drive him into some act of imprudence. At each instant, indeed, he expected to see the swarthy form of the Delaware appearing in the background, like the tiger prowling around the fold. Taking all things into consideration, therefore, he came to the conclusion that it would be better to rejoin his friend, and endeavor to temper his impetuosity by some of his own coolness and discretion. It required but a minute or two to put this plan in execution, the canoe returning to the strand some 10 or 15 minutes after it had left it. Contrary to his expectations, perhaps, Deerslayer found the Indian at his post, from which he had not stirred, fearful that his betrothed might arrive during his absence. A conference followed, in which Chingachgook was made acquainted with the state of things in the camp. When Hist named the point as the place of meeting, it was with the expectation of making her escape from the old position, and of repairing to a spot that she expected to find without any occupants. But the sudden change of localities had disconcerted all her plans. A much greater degree of vigilance than had been previously required was now necessary, and the circumstance that an aged woman was on watch also denoted some special grounds of alarm. All these considerations, and many more that will readily suggest themselves to the reader, were briefly discussed before the young men came to any decision. The occasion, however, being one that required acts instead of words, the course to be pursued was soon chosen. Disposing of the canoe in such a manner that Hist must see it, should she come to the place of meeting previously to their return, the young men looked to their arms and prepared to enter the wood. The whole projection into the lake contained about 2 acres of land, and the part that formed the point and on which the camp was placed did not compose a surface of more than half that size. It was principally covered with oaks, which, as is usual in the American forests, grew to a great height without throwing out a branch, and then arched in a dense and rich foliage. Beneath, except the fringe of thick bushes along the shore, there was very little underbrush, though in consequence of their shape the trees were closer together than is common in regions where the axe has been freely used, resembling tall, straight, rustic columns, upholding the usual canopy of leaves. The surface of the land was tolerably even, but it had a small rise near its centre which divided it into a northern and southern half. On the latter, The Hurons had built their fire, profiting by the formation to conceal it from their enemies, who, it will be remembered, were supposed to be in the castle, which bore northerly. A brook also came brawling down the sides of the adjacent hills, and found its way into the lake on the southern side of the point. It had cut for itself a deep passage through some of the higher portions of the ground, and in later days, when this spot has become subjected to the uses of civilization by its windings and shaded banks, it has become no mean accessory in contributing to the beauty of the place. This brook lay west of the encampment, and its waters found their way into the great reservoir of that region on the same side, and quite near to the spot chosen for the fire. All these peculiarities, so far as circumstances allowed, have been noted by Deerslayer, and explained to his friend. The reader will understand that the little rise in the ground, that lay behind the Indian encampment, greatly favored the secret advance of the two adventurers. It prevented the light of the fire diffusing itself on the ground directly in the rear, although the land fell away towards the water, so as to leave what might be termed the left or eastern flank of the position unprotected by this covering. We have said unprotected, though that is not properly the word, since the knoll behind the huts and the fire offered a cover for those who were now stealthily approaching, rather than any protection to the Indians. Deerslayer did not break through the fringe of bushes immediately abreast of the canoe, which might have brought him too suddenly within the influence of the light, since the hillock did not extend to the water, but he followed the beach northerly until he got nearly on the opposite side of the tongue of land, which brought him under the shelter of the low acclivity, and consequently more in the shadow. As soon as the friends emerged from the bushes, they stopped to reconnoitre. The fire was still blazing behind the little ridge, casting its light upward into the tops of the trees, producing an effect that was more pleasing than advantageous. Still the glare had its uses, for while the background was in obscurity, the foreground was in strong light, exposing the savages and concealing their foes. Profiting by the latter circumstance, the young men advanced cautiously towards the ridge, Deerslayer in front, for he insisted on this arrangement, lest the Delaware should be led by his feelings into some indiscretion. It required but a moment to reach the foot of the little ascent, and then commenced the most critical part of the enterprise. Moving with exceeding caution, and trailing his rifle, both to keep its barrel out of view and in readiness for service, the hunter put foot before foot, until he got sufficiently high to overlook the summit, his own head being alone brought into the light. Chingachgook was at his side, and both paused to take another close examination of the camp. In order, however, to protect themselves against any straggler in the rear, they placed their bodies against the trunk of an oak, standing on the side next the fire. The view that Deerslayer now obtained of the camp was exactly the reverse of that he had perceived from the water. The dim figures which he had formerly discovered must have been on the summit of the ridge, a few feet in advance of the spot where he was now posted, and around him were seated on logs 13 warriors, which accounted for all whom he had seen from the canoe. They were conversing with much earnestness among themselves, the image of the elephant passing from hand to hand. The first burst of savage wonder had abated, and the question now under discussion was the probable existence, the history, and the habits of so extraordinary an animal. We have not leisure to record the opinions of these rude men on a subject so consonant to their lives and experience, but little is hazarded in saying that they were quite as plausible and far more ingenious than half the conjectures that precede the demonstrations of science. However much they may have been at fault as to their conclusions and inferences, it is certain that they discussed the questions with a zealous and most undivided attention. For the time being all else was forgotten, and our adventurers could not have approached at a more fortunate instant. The females were collected near each other, much as Deerslayer had last seen them, nearly in a line between the place where he now stood and the fire. The distance from the oak against which the young men leaned and the warriors was about 30 yards. The women may have been half that number of yards nigher. The latter, indeed, were so near as to make the utmost circumspection as to motion and noise indispensable. Although they conversed in their low, soft voices, it was possible, in the profound stillness of the woods, even to catch passages of the discourse, and the light-hearted laugh that escaped the girls might occasionally have reached the canoe. Deerslayer felt that the tremolo that passed through the frame of his friend when the latter first caught the sweet sounds that issued from the plump, pretty lips of Hist. He even laid a hand on the shoulder of the Indian, as a sort of admonition to command himself. As the conversation grew more earnest, each leaned forward to listen. "The Hurons have more curious beasts than that," said one of the girls, contemptuously, for like the men they conversed of the elephant and his qualities. "The Delawares will think this creature wonderful, but tomorrow no Huron tongue will talk of it. Our young men will find him if the animals dare to come near our wigwams." This was in fact addressed to Wah-ta-Wah, though she who spoke uttered the words with an assumed diffidence and humility that prevented her looking at the other. "The Delawares are so far from letting such creatures come into their country," returned Hist, "that no one has even seen their images there. Their young men would frighten away the images as well as the beasts." "The Delaware young men! The nation is women. Even the deer walk when they hear their hunters coming. Who has ever heard the name of a young Delaware warrior?" This was said in good humor and with a laugh, but it was also said bitingly. That Hist so felt it was apparent by the spirit betrayed in her answer. "Who has ever heard the name of a young Delaware?" she repeated earnestly. "Tamenund himself, though now as old as the pines on the hill, or as the eagles in the air, was once young. His name was heard from the great salt lake to the sweet waters of the west. What is the family of Uncas? Where is there another as great, though the pale-faces have plowed up its grates, and trodden on its bones? Do the eagles fly as high? Is the deer as swift, or the panther as brave? Is there no young warrior of that race? Let the Huron maidens open their eyes wider, and they may see one called Chingachgook, who is as stately as a young ash, and as tough as the hickory." As the girl used her figurative language and told her companions to open their eyes and they would see the Delaware, Deerslayer thrust his fingers into the sides of his friend, and indulged in a fit of his hearty benevolent laughter. The others smiled, but the language of the speaker was too flattering, and the tones of her voice too sweet for him to be led away by any accidental coincidence, however ludicrous. The speech of Hist produced a retort, and the dispute, though conducted in good humor, and without any of the coarse violence of tone and gesture that often impairs the charms of the sex in what is called civilized life, grew warm and slightly clamorous. In the midst of this scene, the Delaware caused his friend to stoop, so as completely to conceal himself, and then he made a noise so closely resembling the little chirrup of the smallest species of the American squirrel, that Deerslayer himself, though he had heard the imitation 100 times, actually thought it came from one of the little animals skipping about over his head. The sound is so familiar in the woods that none of the Hurons paid it the least attention. Hist, however, instantly ceased talking, and sat motionless. Still she had sufficient self-command to abstain from turning her head. She had heard the signal by which her lover so often called her from the wigwam to the stolen interview, and it came over her senses and her heart, as the serenade affects the maiden in the land of song. From that moment, Chingachgook felt certain that his presence was known. This was effecting much, and he could now hope for a bolder line of conduct on the part of his mistress than she might dare to adopt under an uncertainty of his situation. It left no doubt of her endeavoring to aid him in his effort to release her. Deerslayer arose as soon as the signal was given, and though he had never held that sweet communion which is known only to lovers, he was not slow to detect the great change that had come over the manner of the girl. She still affected to dispute, though it was no longer with spirit and ingenuity, but what she said was uttered more as a lure to draw her antagonists on to an easy conquest, than with any hopes of succeeding herself. Once or twice, it is true, her native readiness suggested a retort, or an argument that raised a laugh, and gave her a momentary advantage. But these little sallies, the offspring of mother-wit, served the better to conceal her real feelings, and to give to the triumph of the other party a more natural air than it might have possessed without them. At length, the disputants became wearied, and they rose in a body as if about to separate. It was now that Hist, for the first time, ventured to turn her face in the direction whence the signal had come. In doing this, her movements were natural but guarded, and she stretched her arm and yawned, as if overcome with a desire to sleep. The chirrup was again heard, and the girl felt satisfied as to the position of her lover, though the strong light in which she herself was placed, and the comparative darkness in which the adventurers stood, prevented her from seeing their heads, the only portions of their forms that appeared above the ridge at all. The tree against which they were posted had a dark shadow cast upon it by the intervention of an enormous pine that grew between it and the fire, a circumstance which alone would have rendered objects within its cloud invisible at any distance. This Deerslayer well knew, and it was one of the reasons why he had selected this particular tree. The moment was near when it became necessary for Hist to act. She was to sleep in a small hut, or bower, that had been built near where she stood, and her companion was the aged hag already mentioned. Once within the hut, with this sleepless old woman stretched across the entrance, as was her nightly practice, the hope of escape was nearly destroyed, and she might at any moment be summoned to her bed. Luckily, at this instant, one of the warriors called to the old woman by name, and bade her bring him water to drink. There was a delicious spring on the northern side of the point, and the hag took a gourd from a branch, and summoning Hist to her side, she moved towards the summit of the ridge, intending to descend and cross the point to the natural fountain. All this was seen and understood by the adventurers, and they fell back into the obscurity, concealing their persons by trees, until the two females had passed them. In walking, Hist was held tightly by the hand. As she moved by the tree that hid Chingachgook and his friend, the former felt for his tomahawk, with the intention to bury it in the brain of the woman. But the other saw the hazard of such a measure, since a single scream might bring all the warriors upon them, and he was averse to the act on considerations of humanity. His hand, therefore, prevented the blow. Still, as the two moved past, the chirrup was repeated, and the Huron woman stopped and faced the tree whence the sounds seemed to proceed, standing at the moment within 6 feet of her enemies. She expressed her surprise that a squirrel should be in motion at so late an hour, and said it boded evil. Hist answered that she had heard the same squirrel 3 times within the last 20 minutes, and that she supposed it was waiting to obtain some of the crumbs left from the late supper. This explanation appeared satisfactory, and they moved towards the spring, the men following stealthily and closely. The gourd was filled, and the old woman was hurrying back, her hand still grasping the wrist of the girl, when she was suddenly seized so violently by the throat as to cause her to release her captive, and to prevent her making any other sound than a sort of gurgling, suffocating noise. The Serpent passed his arm around the waist of his mistress, and dashed through the bushes with her on the north side of the point. Here he immediately turned along the beach, and ran towards the canoe. A more direct course could have been taken, but it might have led to a discovery of the place of embarking. Deerslayer kept playing on the throat of the old woman like the keys of an organ, occasionally allowing her to breathe, and then compressing his fingers again nearly to strangling. The brief intervals for breath, however, were well improved, and the hag succeeded in letting out a screech or two that served to alarm the camp. The tramp of the warriors, as they sprang from the fire, was plainly audible, and at the next moment 3 or 4 of them appeared on the top of the ridge, drawn against the background of light, resembling the dim shadows of the phantasmagoria. It was now quite time for the hunter to retreat. Tripping up the heels of his captive, and giving her throat a parting squeeze, quite as much in resentment at her indomitable efforts to sound the alarm as from any policy, he left her on her back, and moved towards the bushes, his rifle at a poise, and his head over his shoulders, like a lion at bay. End of chapter 16. Recording by Bill Borst. Chapter 17 of the Deerslayer. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Deerslayer by James Fenimore Cooper. Chapter 17. There, ye wise saints, behold your light, your star. Ye would be dupes and victims, and ye are. Is it enough? Or must I, while a thrill lives in your sapient bosoms, cheat you still? Thomas Moore, Lalla Rookh, The Veiled Prophet of Khorasan. The fire, the canoe, and the spring, near which Deerslayer commenced his retreat, would have stood in the angles of a triangle of tolerably equal sides. The distance from the fire to the boat was a little less than the distance from the fire to the spring, while the distance from the spring to the boat was about equal to that between the 2 points first named. This, however, was in straight lines, a means of escape to which the fugitives could not resort. They were obliged to have recourse to a detour in order to get the cover of the bushes, and to follow the curvature of the beach. Under these disadvantages, then, the hunter commenced his retreat. Disadvantages that he felt to be so much the greater from his knowledge of the habits of all Indians, who rarely fail, in cases of sudden alarms, more especially when in the midst of cover, immediately to throw out flankers, with a view to meet their foes at all points, and if possible to turn their rear. That some such course was now adopted he believed from the tramp of feet, which not only came up the ascent, as related, but were also heard, under the first impulse, diverging not only towards the hill in the rear, but towards the extremity of the point, in a direction opposite to that he was about to take himself. Promptitude consequently became a matter of the last importance, as the parties might meet on the strand before the fugitive could reach the canoe. Notwithstanding the pressing nature of the emergency, Deerslayer hesitated a single instant ere he plunged into the bushes that lined the shore. His feelings had been awakened by the whole scene, and a sternness of purpose had come over him, to which he was ordinarily a stranger. 4 dark figures loomed on the ridge, drawn against the brightness of the fire, and an enemy might have been sacrificed at a glance. The Indians had paused to gaze into the gloom, in search of the screeching hag, and with many a man less given to reflection than the hunter, the death of one of them would have been certain. Luckily he was more prudent. Although the rifle dropped a little towards the foremost of his pursuers, he did not aim or fire, but disappeared in the cover. To gain the beach, and to follow it round to the place where Chingachgook was already in the canoe, with Hist, anxiously waiting his appearance, occupied but a moment. Laying his rifle in the bottom of the canoe, Deerslayer stooped to give the latter a vigorous shove from the shore, when a powerful Indian leaped through the bushes, alighting like a panther on his back. Everything was now suspended by a hair, a false step ruining all. With a generosity that would have rendered a Roman illustrious throughout all time, but which in the career of one so simple and humble would have been forever lost to the world but for this unpretending legend, Deerslayer threw all his force into a desperate effort, shoved the canoe off with a power that sent it 100 feet from the shore, as it might be in an instant, and fell forward into the lake himself, face downward, his assailant necessarily following him. Although the water was deep within a few yards of the beach, it was not more than breast-high, as close in as the spot where the 2 combatants fell. Still, this was quite sufficient to destroy one who had sunk, under the great disadvantages in which Deerslayer was placed. His hands were free, however, and the savage was compelled to relinquish his hug, to keep his own face above the surface. For half a minute there was a desperate struggle, like the floundering of an alligator that has just seized some powerful prey, and then both stood erect, grasping each other's arms, in order to prevent the use of the deadly knife in the darkness. What might have been the issue of this severe personal struggle cannot be known, for 6 savages came leaping into the water to the aid of their friend, and Deerslayer yielded himself a prisoner, with a dignity that was as remarkable as his self-devotion. To quit the lake and lead their new captive to the fire occupied the Indians but another minute. So much engaged were they all with the struggle and its consequences, that the canoe was unseen, though it still lay so near the shore as to render every syllable that was uttered perfectly intelligible to the Delaware and his betrothed. And the whole party left the spot, some continuing the pursuit after Hist along the beach, though most proceeded to the light. Here Deerslayer's antagonist so far recovered his breath and his recollection, for he had been throttled nearly to strangulation, as to relate the manner in which the girl had got off. It was now too late to assail the other fugitives, for no sooner was his friend led into the bushes than the Delaware placed his paddle into the water, and the light canoe glided noiselessly away, holding its course towards the center of the lake until safe from shot, after which it sought the ark. When Deerslayer reached the fire, he found himself surrounded by no less than 8 grim savages, among whom was his old acquaintance Rivenoak. As soon as the latter caught a glimpse of the captive's countenance, he he spoke apart to his companions, and a low but general exclamation of pleasure and surprise escaped them. They knew that the conqueror of their late friend, he who had fallen on the opposite side of the lake, was in their hands, and subject to their mercy, or vengeance. There was no little admiration mingled in the ferocious looks that were thrown on the prisoner, an admiration that was as much excited by his present composure as by his past deeds. This scene may be said to have been the commencement of the great and terrible reputation that Deerslayer, or Hawkeye, as he was afterwards called, enjoyed among all the tribes of New York and Canada, a reputation that was certainly more limited in its territorial and numerical extent than those which are possessed in civilized life, but which was compensated for what it wanted, in these particulars, perhaps, by its greater justice, and the total absence of mystification and management. The arms of Deerslayer were not pinioned, and he was left the free use of his hands, his knife having been first removed. The only precaution that was taken to secure his person was untiring watchfulness, and a strong rope of bark that passed from ankle to ankle, not so much to prevent his walking, as to place an obstacle in the way of his attempting to escape by any sudden leap. Even this extra provision against flight was not made until the captive had been brought to the light, and his character ascertained. It was, in fact, a compliment to his prowess, and he felt proud of the distinction. That he might be bound when the warriors slept he thought probable, but to be bound in the moment of capture showed that he was already, and thus early, attaining a name. While the young Indians were fastening the rope, he wondered if Chingachgook would have been treated in the same manner, had he too fallen into the hands of the enemy. Nor did the reputation of the young pale-face rest altogether on his success in the previous combat, or in his discriminating and cool manner of managing the late negotiation, for it had received a great accession by the occurrences of the night. Ignorant of the movements of the Ark, and of the accident that had brought their fire into view, the Iroquois attributed the discovery of their new camp to the vigilance of so shrewd a foe. The manner in which he ventured upon the point, the abstraction or escape of Hist, and most of all the self-devotion of the prisoner, united to the readiness with which he had sent the canoe adrift, were so many important links in the chain of facts on which his growing fame was founded. Many of these circumstances had been seen, some had been explained, and all were understood. While this admiration and these honors were so unreservedly bestowed on Deerslayer, he did not escape some of the penalties of his situation. He was permitted to seat himself on the end of a log near the fire, in order to dry his clothes, his late adversary remaining opposite, now holding articles of his own scanty vestments to the heat, and now feeling his throat, on which the marks of his enemy's fingers were still quite visible. The rest of the warriors consulted together near at hand, all those who had been out having returned to report that no signs of any other prowlers near the camp were to be found. In this state of things, the old woman, whose name was She-Bear, in plain English, approached Deerslayer, with her fists clenched and her eyes flashing fire. Hitherto she had been occupied with screaming, an employment at which she had played her part with no small degree of success. But having succeeded in effectually alarming all within reach of a pair of lungs that had been strengthened by long practice, she next turned her attention to the injuries her own person had sustained in the struggle. These were in no manner material, though they were of a nature to arouse all the fury of a woman who had long ceased to attract by means of the gentler qualities, and who was much disposed to revenge the hardships she had so long endured, as the neglected wife and mother of savages, on all who came within her power. If Deerslayer had not permanently injured her, he had temporarily caused her to suffer, and she was not a person to overlook a wrong of this nature, on account of its motive. "Skunk of the pale-faces!" commenced this exasperated and semi-poetic fury, shaking her fist under the nose of the impassible hunter. "You are not even a woman! Your friends, the Delawares, are only women, and you are their sheep. Your own people will not own you, and no tribe of red men would have you in their wigwams. You skulk among petticoated warriors. You slay our brave friend who has left us? No, his great soul scorned to fight you, and left his body rather than have the shame of slaying you. But the blood that you spilt, when the spirit was not looking on, has not sunk into the ground. It must be buried in your groans. What music do I hear? Those are not the wailings of a red man. No red warrior groans so much like a hog. They come from a pale-face throat, a Yengeese bosom, and sound as pleasant as girls singing. Dog, skunk, woodchuck, mink, hedgehog, pig, toad, spider, yengi." Here the old woman, having expended her breath and exhausted her epithets, was fain to pause a moment, though both her fists were shaken in the prisoner's face, and the whole of her wrinkled countenance was filled with fierce resentment. Deerslayer looked upon these impotent attempts to arouse him as indifferently as a gentleman in our own state of society regards the vituperative terms of a blackguard, the one party feeling that the tongue of an old woman could never injure a warrior, and the other knowing that mendacity and vulgarity can only permanently affect those who resort to their use. But he was spared any further attack at present by the interposition of Rivenoak, who shoved aside the hag, bidding her quit the spot, and prepared to take his seat at the side of his prisoner. The old woman withdrew, but the hunter well understood that he was to be the subject of all her means of annoyance, if not of positive injury, so long as he remained in the power of his enemies, for nothing rankles so deeply as the consciousness that an attempt to irritate has been met by contempt, a feeling that is usually the most passive of any that is harbored in the human breast. Rivenoak quietly took the seat we have mentioned, and after a short pause, he commenced a dialogue which we translate as usual, for the benefit of those readers who have not studied the North American languages. "My pale-face friend is very welcome," said the Indian with a familiar nod, and a smile so covert that it required all Deerslayer's vigilance to detect, and not a little of his philosophy to detect unmoved. "He is welcome. The Hurons keep a hot fire to dry the white man's clothes by." "I thank you, Huron, or Mingo, as I most like to call you," returned the other. "I thank you for the welcome, and I thank you for the fire. Each is good in its way, and the last is very good, when one has been in a spring as cold as the Glimmerglass. Even Huron warmth may be pleasant, at such a time, to a man with a Delaware heart." "The pale-face, but my brother has a name? So great a warrior would not have lived without a name?" "Mingo," said the hunter, a little of the weakness of human nature exhibiting itself in the glance of his eye, and the color on his cheek. "Mingo, your brave called me Hawkeye, I suppose on account of a quick and sartain aim, when he was lying with his head in my lap afore his spirit started for the happy hunting grounds. 'Tis a good name. The hawk is sure of his blow. Hawkeye is not a woman. Why does he live with the Delawares?" "I understand you, Mingo. But we look on all that as a sarcumvention of some of your subtle devils, and deny the charge. Providence placed me among the Delawares young, and, bating what Christian usages demand of my color and gifts, I hope to live and die in their tribe. Still, I do not mean to throw away altogether my native rights, and shall strive to do a pale-face's duty in red-skin society." "Good. A Huron is a red-skin as well as a Delaware. Hawkeye is more of a Huron than of a woman." "I suppose you know, Mingo, your own meaning. If you don't, I make no question 'tis well known to Satan. But if you wish to get anything out of me, speak plainer, for bargains cannot be made blindfolded, or tongue-tied." "Good. Hawkeye has not a forked tongue, and he likes to say what he thinks. He is an acquaintance of the Muskrat," this was the name by which all the Indians designated Hutter, "and has lived in his wigwam. But he is not a friend. He wants no scalps, like a miserable Indian, but fights like a stout-hearted pale-face. The Muskrat is neither white nor red, neither a beast nor a fish. He is a water-snake, sometimes in the spring and sometimes on the land. He looks for scalps, like an outcast. Hawkeye can go back and tell him how he has outwitted the Hurons, how he has escaped, and when his eyes are in a fog, when he can't see as far as from his cabin to the shore, then Hawkeye can open the door for the Hurons. And how will the plunder be divided? Why, Hawkeye will carry away the most, and the Hurons will take what he may choose to leave behind him. The scalps can go to Canada, for a pale-face has no satisfaction in them." "Well, well, Rivenoak, for so I hear 'em term you, this is plain English enough, though spoken in Iroquois. I understand all you mean, now, and must say it out-devils even Mingo deviltry. No doubt 'twould be easy enough to go back and tell the Muskrat that I had got away from you, and gain some credit, too, by the expl'ite." "Good. That is what I want the pale-face to do." "Yes, yes, that's plain enough. I know what you want me to do, without more words. When inside the house, and eating the muskrat's bread, and laughing and talking with his pretty darters, I might put his eyes into so thick a fog that he couldn't even see the door, much less the land. Good! Hawkeye should have been born a Huron. His blood is not more than half white. There you're out, Huron. Yes, there you're as much out as if you mistook a wolf for a catamount. I'm white in blood, heart, natur', and gifts, though a little red-skin in feelin's and habits. But when old Hutter's eyes are well befogged, and his pretty darters perhaps in a deep sleep, and Hurry Harry, the great pine as you Indians tarm him, is dreaming of anything but mischief, and all suppose Hawkeye is acting as a faithful sentinel, all I have to do is set a torch somewhere in sight for a signal, open the door, and let in the Hurons, to knock 'em all on the head. Surely my brother is mistaken. He cannot be white. He is worthy to be a great chief among the Hurons. That is true enough, I dares to say, if he could do all this. Now harkee, Huron, and for once hear a few honest words from the mouth of a plain man. I am Christian born, and them that come of such a stock, and that listen to the words that were spoken to their fathers, and will be spoken to their children, until 'arth and all it holds perishes, can be, and are, lawful. But sarcumventions, and deceit, and treachery among friends are fit only for the pale-faced devils. I know that there are white men enough to give you this wrong idea of our nature, but such be untrue to their blood and gifts, and ought to be, if they are not, outcasts and vagabonds. No upright pale-face could do what you wish, and to be as plain with you as I wish to be, in my judgment, no upright Delaware either. With a Mingo it may be different." The Huron listened to this rebuke with obvious disgust, but he had his ends in view, and was too wily to lose all chance of effecting them by a precipitate avowal of resentment. Affecting to smile, he seemed to listen eagerly, and he then pondered on what he had heard. "Does Hawkeye love the Muskrat?" he abruptly demanded, "or does he love his daughters?" "Neither, Mingo. Old Tom is not a man to gain my love, and as for the darters, they are comely enough to gain the liking of any young man. But there's reason ag'in any very great love for either. Hetty is a good soul, but natur' has laid a heavy hand on her mind, poor thing." "And the Wild Rose?" exclaimed the Huron, for the fame of Judith's beauty had spread among those who could travel the wilderness as well as the highway by means of old eagles' nests, rocks, and riven trees, known to them by report and tradition, as well as among the white borderers. "And the Wild Rose, is she not sweet enough to be put in the bosom of my brother?" Deerslayer had far too much of the innate gentleman to insinuate aught against the fair fame of who, by nature and position, was so helpless, and as he did not choose to utter an untruth, he preferred being silent. The Huron mistook the motive, and supposed that disappointed affection lay at the bottom of his reserve. Still bent on corrupting or bribing his captive, in order to obtain the possession of the treasures with which his imagination filled the castle, he persevered in his attack. "Hawkeye is talking with a friend," he continued. "He knows that Rivenoak is a man of his word, for they have traded together, and trade opens the soul. My friend has come here on account of a little string held by a girl that can pull the whole body of the sternest warrior?" "You are nearer the truth now, Huron, than you've been afore, since we began to talk. This is true, but one end of that string was not fast to my heart, nor did the Wild Rose hold the other." "This is wonderful. Does my brother love in his head, and not in his heart? And can the feeble mind pull so hard against so stout a warrior?" "There it is again. Sometimes right, and sometimes wrong. The string you mean is fast to the heart of a great Delaware, one of Mohican stock, in fact, living among the Delawares since the dispersion of his own people, and of the family of Uncas, Chingachgook by name, or Great Sarpent. He has come here, led by the string, and I've followed, or rather come afore, for I got here first, pulled by nothing stronger than friendship, which is strong enough for such as are not niggardly of their feelin's, and are willing to live a little for their fellow creatures, as well as for themselves. But a string has two ends. One is fast to the mind of a Mohican, and the other? Why, the other was here close to the fire half an hour since. Wah-ta-Wah held it in her hand, if she didn't hold it to her heart." "I understand what you mean, my brother," returned the Indian gravely, for the first time catching a direct clue to the adventures of the evening. "The Great Serpent, being strongest, pulled the hardest, and Hist was forced to leave us." "I don't think there was much pulling about it," answered the other, laughing, always in his silent manner, with as much heartiness as if he were not a captive, and in danger of torture or death. "I don't think there was much pulling about it. No, I don't. Lord help you, Huron, he likes the gal, and the gal likes him, and it surpassed Huron circumventions to keep the two people apart, where there was so strong a feelin' to bring 'em together." "And Hawkeye and Chingachgook came into our camp on this errand only?" "That's a question that'll answer itself, Mingo. Yes, if a question could talk, it would answer itself, to your parfect satisfaction. For what else should we come? And yet it isn't exactly so, neither, for we didn't come into your camp at all, but only as far as that pine there, that you see on the other side of the ridge, where we stood watching your movements and conduct as long as we liked. When we were ready, the Sarpent gave his signal, and then all went just as it should, down to the moment when yonder vagabond leaped upon my back. Sartain, we come for that, and for no other purpose, and we got what we come for. There's no use in pretending otherwise. Hist is off with a man who's the next thing to her husband, and come what will to me, that's one good thing detarmined." "What sign or signal told the young maiden that her lover was nigh?" asked the Huron with more curiosity than it was usual for him to betray. Deerslayer laughed again, and seemed to enjoy the success of the exploit, with as much glee as if he had not been its victim. "Your squirrels are great gadabouts, Mingo," he cried, still laughing. "Yes, they're sartainly great gadabouts. When other folks' squirrels are at home and asleep, your'n keep in motion among the trees, and chirrup and sing in a way that even a Delaware gal can understand their music. Well, there's four-legged squirrels, and there's two-legged squirrels, and give me the last, when there's a good tight string atween two hearts. If one brings 'em together, t'other tells when to pull hardest." The Huron looked vexed, though he succeeded in suppressing any violent exhibition of resentment. He now quitted his prisoner, and joining the rest of the warriors, he communicated the substance of what he had learned. As in his own case, admiration was mingled with anger at the boldness and success of their enemies. 3 or 4 of them ascended the little acclivity, and gazed at the tree where it was understood the adventurers had posted themselves, and one even descended to it, and examined for footprints around its roots, in order to make sure that the statement was true. The result confirmed the story of the captive, and they all returned to the fire with increased wonder and respect. The messenger who had arrived with some communication from the party above, while the 2 adventurers were watching the camp, was now dispatched with some answer, and doubtless bore with him the intelligence of all that had happened. Down to this moment, the young Indian, who had been seen walking in company with Hist and another female, had made no advances to any communication with Deerslayer. He had held himself aloof from his friends, even, passing near the bevy of younger women, who were clustering together, apart as usual, and conversed in low tones on the subject of the escape of their late companion. Perhaps it would be true to say that these last were pleased as well as vexed at what had just occurred. Their female sympathies were with the lovers, while their pride was bound up in the success of their own tribe. It is possible, too, that the superior personal advantages of Hist rendered her dangerous to some of the younger part of the group, and they were not sorry to find she was no longer in the way of their own ascendancy. On the whole, however, the better feeling was most prevalent, for neither the wild condition in which they lived, the clannish prejudices of tribes, nor their hard fortunes as Indian women, could entirely conquer the inextinguishable leaning of their sex to the affections. One of the girls even laughed at the disconsolate look of the swain who might fancy himself deserted, a circumstance that seemed suddenly to arouse his energies, and induce him to move towards the log, on which the prisoner was still seated, drying his clothes. "This is Catamount," said the Indian, striking his hand boastfully on his naked breast, as he uttered the words in a manner to show how much weight he expected them to carry. "This is Hawkeye," quietly returned Deerslayer, adopting the name by which he knew he would be known in future among all the tribes of the Iroquois. "My sight is keen. Is my brother's leap long?" "From here to the Delaware villages. Hawkeye has stolen my wife. He must bring her back, or his scalp will hang on a pole and dry in my wigwam." "Hawkeye has stolen nothing, Huron. He doesn't come of a thieving breed, nor has he thieving gifts. Your wife, as you call Wah-ta-Wah, will never be the wife of any red-skin of the Canadas. Her mind is in the cabin of a Delaware, and her body has gone to find it. The catamount is active, I know, but its legs can't keep pace with a woman's wishes. The Serpent of the Delawares is a dog. He is a poor bull trout that keeps in the water. He is afraid to stand on the hard earth, like a brave Indian." "Well, well, Huron, that's pretty impudent, considering it's not an hour since the Sarpent stood within 100 feet of you, and would have tried the toughness of your skin with a rifle bullet, when I pointed you out to him, hadn't I laid the weight of a little judgment on his hand. You may take in timorsome gals in the settlements, with your catamount whine, but the ears of a man can tell truth from untruth." Hist laughs at him. She sees he is lame, and a poor hunter, and has never been on a war-path. She will take a man for a husband, and not a fish. "How do you know that, Catamount? How do you know that?" returned Deerslayer, laughing. "She has gone into the lake, you see, and maybe she prefars a trout to a mongrel cat. As for war-paths, neither the Sarpent nor I have much experience, we are ready to own. But if you don't call this one, you must tarm it what the gals in the settlements tarm it, the high road to matrimony. Take my advice, Catamount, and search for a wife among the Huron women. You'll never get one with a willing mind from among the Delawares." Catamount's hand felt for his tomahawk, and when the fingers reached the handle they worked convulsively, as if their owner hesitated between policy and resentment. At this critical moment Rivenoak approached, and by a gesture of authority induced the young man to retire, assuming his former position, himself, on the log at the side of Deerslayer. Here he continued silent for a little time, maintaining the grave reserve of an Indian chief. "Hawkeye is right," the Iroquois at length began. "His sight is so strong that he can see truth in a dark night, and our eyes have been blinded. He is an owl, darkness hiding nothing from him. He ought not to strike his friends. He is right." "I am glad you think so, Mingo," returned the other, "for a traitor, in my judgment, is worse than a coward. I care as little for the muskrat as one pale-face ought to care for another, but I care too much for him to ambush him in the way you wished. In short, according to my idees, any sarcumventions, except open war sarcumventions, are ag'in both law and what we whites call gospel, too. My pale-face brother is right. He is no Indian, to forget his Manitou and his color. The Hurons know that they have a great warrior for their prisoner, and they will treat him as one. If he is to be tortured, his torments shall be such as no common man can bear. If he is to be treated as a friend, it will be the friendship of chiefs." As the Huron uttered this extraordinary assurance of consideration, his eye furtively glanced at the countenance of his listener, in order to discover how he stood the compliment, though his gravity and apparent sincerity would have prevented any man but one practised in artifices from detecting his motives. Deerslayer belonged to the class of the unsuspicious, and acquainted with the Indian notions of what constitutes respect, in matters connected with the treatment of captives, he felt his blood chill at the announcement, even while he maintained an aspect so steeled that his quick-sighted enemy could discover in it no signs of weakness. "God has put me in your hands, Huron," the captive at length answered, "and I suppose you will act your will on me. I shall not boast of what I can do under torment, for I've never been tried, and no man can say till he has been. But I'll do my endeavors not to disgrace the people among whom I got my training. Howsever, I wish you now to bear witness that I'm altogether of white blood, and, in a natural way, of white gifts, too. So, should I be overcome and forget myself, I hope you'll lay the fault where it properly belongs, and in no manner put it on the Delawares, or their allies and friends, the Mohicans. We're all created with more or less weakness, and I'm afeard it's a pale-face's to give in under great bodily torment, when a red-skin will sing his songs, and boast of his deeds in the very teeth of his foes. We shall see. Hawkeye has a good countenance, and he is tough, but why should he be tormented when the Hurons love him? He is not born their enemy, and the death of one warrior will not cast a cloud between them forever." "So much the better, Huron, so much the better. Still, I don't wish to owe anything to a mistake about each other's meaning. It is so much the better that you bear no malice for the loss of a warrior who fell in war, and yet it is untrue that there is no enmity, lawful enmity, I mean, atween us. So far as I have red-skin feelin's at all, I've Delaware feelin's, and I leave you to judge for yourself how far they are likely to be friendly to the Mingos." Deerslayer ceased, for a sort of spectre stood before him, that put a stop to his words, and indeed caused him for a moment to doubt the fidelity of his boasted vision. Hetty Hutter was standing at the side of the fire as quietly as if she belonged to the tribe. As the hunter and the Indian sat watching the emotions that were betrayed in each other's countenance, the girl had approached unnoticed, doubtless ascending from the beach on the southern side of the point, or that next to the spot where the ark had anchored, and had advanced to the fire with the fearlessness that belonged to her simplicity, and which was certainly justified by the treatment formerly received from the Indians. As soon as Rivenoak perceived the girl, she was recognized, and calling to 2 or 3 of the younger warriors, the chief sent them out to reconnoitre, lest her appearance should be the forerunner of another attack. He then motioned to Hetty to draw near. "I hope your visit is a sign that the Sarpent and Hist are in safety, Hetty," said Deerslayer, as soon as the girl had complied with the Huron's request. "I don't think you'd come ashore ag'in, on the arrand that brought you here afore." "Judith told me to come this time, Deerslayer," Hetty replied. "She paddled me ashore herself, in a canoe, as soon as the Serpent had shown her Hist and told his story. How handsome Hist is to-night, Deerslayer, and how much happier she looks than when she was with the Hurons." "That's natur', gal, yes, that may be set down as human natur'. She's with her betrothed, and no longer fears a Mingo husband. In my judgment, Judith herself would lose most of her beauty if she thought she was to bestow it all on a Mingo. Content is a great fortifier of good looks, and I'll warrant you Hist is contented enough, now she is out of the hands of these miscreants, and with her chosen warrior. Did you say that Judith told you to come ashore? Why should your sister do that? She bid me to come to see you, and to try and persuade the savages to take more elephants to let you off. But I've brought the Bible with me. That will do more than all the elephants in father's chest." "And your father, good little Hetty, and Hurry, did they know of your arrand?" "Not they. Both are asleep, and Judith and the Serpent thought it best they should not be woke, lest they might want to come again after scalps, when Hist had told them how few warriors, and how many women and children there were in the camp. Judith would give me no peace till I had come ashore to see what had happened to you." "Well, that's remarkable as consarns Judith. Why should she feel so much unsartainty about me? Ah! I see how it is, now. Yes, I see into the whole matter, now. You must understand, Hetty, that your sister is uneasy, lest Harry March should wake, and come blundering here into the hands of the inimy, ag'in, under some idee that, being a travelling comrade, he ought to help me in this matter. Hurry is a blunderer, I will allow, but I don't think he'd risk as much for my sake, as he would for his own." "Judith don't care for Hurry, though Hurry cares for her," replied Hetty, innocently, but quite positively. "I've heard you say as much as that afore. Yes, I've heard that from you afore, gal, and yet it isn't true. One don't live in a tribe, not to see something of the way in which liking works in a woman's heart. Though no way given to marrying myself, I've been a looker on among the Delawares, and this is a matter in which pale face and red skin gifts are all as one as the same. When the feelin' begins, the young woman is thoughtful, and has no eyes or ears, unless for the warrior that has taken her fancy. Then follows melancholy, and sighing, and such sort of actions; after which, especially if matters don't come to plain discourse, she often flies round to backbiting and fault-finding, blaming the youth for the very things she likes best in him. Some young creatures are forward in this way of showing their love, and I'm of opinion Judith is one of 'em. Now I've heard her as much as deny that Hurry was good looking, and the young woman who could do that must be far gone indeed. The young woman who liked Hurry would own that he is handsome. I think Hurry very handsome, Deerslayer, and I'm sure everybody must think so, that has eyes. Judith don't like Harry March, and that's the reason she finds fault with him. Well, well, my good little Hetty, have it your own way. If we should talk from now till winter, each would think as at present, and there's no use in words. I must believe that Judith is much wrapped up in Harry, and that sooner or later she'll have him, and this, too, all the more from the manner in which she abuses him. And I dare to say you think just the contrary. But mind what I now tell you, gal, and pretend not to know it," continued this being who was so obtuse on a point on which men are usually quick enough to make discoveries, and so acute in matters that would baffle the observation of much the greater portion of mankind. "I see how it is with them vagabonds. Rivenoak has left us, you see, and is talking yonder with his young men, and though too far to be heard, I can see what he is telling them. Their orders is to watch your movements, and to find where the canoe is to meet you, to take you back to the Ark, and then to seize all and what they can. I'm sorry Judith sent you, for I suppose she wants you to go back again." "All that's settled, Deerslayer," returned the girl in a low, confidential, and meaning manner, "and you may trust me to outwit the best Indian of them all. I know I am feeble-minded, but I've got some sense, and you'll see how I use it in getting back, when my errand is done." "Ahs me, poor girl, I'm afeard all that's easier said than done. They're a venomous set of riptyles, and their p'ison's none the milder, for the loss of Hist. Well, I'm glad the Sarpent was the one to get off with the gal, for now they'll be two happy at least, whereas had he fallen into the hands of the Mingos, there'd been two miserable, and another far from feelin' as a man likes to feel. Now you put me in mind of a part of my errand that I had almost forgotten, Deerslayer. Judith told me to ask you what you thought the Hurons would do with you, if you couldn't be bought off, and what she had best do to serve you. Yes, this was the most important part of the errand, what she had best do in order to serve you. That's as you think, Hetty, but it's no matter. Young women are apt to lay most stress on what most touches their feelin's, but no matter. Have it your own way, so you be but careful not to let the vagabonds get the mastery of a canoe. When you get back to the Ark, tell 'em to keep close, and to keep moving, too, most especially at night. Many hours can't go by without the troops on the river hearing of this party, and then your friends may look for relief. 'Tis but a day's march from the nearest garrison, and true soldiers will never lie idle with the foe in their neighborhood. This is my advice, and you may say to your father and Hurry that scalp hunting will be a poor business now, as the Mingos are up and awake, and nothing can save 'em, till the troops come, except keeping a good belt of water atween them and the savages." "What shall I tell Judith about you, Deerslayer? I know she will send me back again if I don't bring her the truth about you." "Then tell her the truth. I see no reason Judith Hutter shouldn't hear the truth about me, as well as a lie. I'm a captive in Indian hands, and Providence only knows what will come of it. Harkee, Hetty," dropping his voice and speaking still more confidentially, "you are a little weak-minded, it must be allowed, but you know something of Injins. Here I am in their hands, after having slain one of their stoutest warriors, and they've been endeavoring to work upon me through fear of consequences, to betray your father and all in the Ark. I understand the blackguards, as well as if they'd told it all out plainly with their tongues. They hold up avarice afore me, on one side, and fear on t'other, and think honesty will give way between 'em both. But let your father and Hurry know 'tis all useless. As for the Sarpent, he knows it already." "But what shall I tell Judith? She will certainly send me back, if I don't satisfy her mind." "Well, tell Judith the same. No doubt the savages will try the torments to make me give in, and to revenge the loss of their warrior, but I must hold out ag'in natural weakness, in the best manner I can. You may tell Judith to feel no consarn on my account. It will come hard, I know, seeing that a white man's gifts don't run to boasting and singing under torment, for he generally feels smallest when he suffers most. But you may tell her not to have any consarn. I think I shall make out to stand it, and she may rely on this, let me give in as much as I may, and prove completely that I am white, by wailings and howlings, and even tears, yet I'll never fall so far as to betray my friends. When it gets to burning holes in the flesh, with heated ramrods, and to hacking the body, and tearing the hair out by the roots, nature may get the upper hand, so far as groans and complaints are concerned, but there the triumph of the vagabonds will end. Nothing short of God's abandoning him to the devils can make an honest man untrue to his color and duty." Hetty listened with great attention, and her mild but speaking countenance manifested a strong sympathy in the anticipated agony of the supposititious sufferer. At first she seemed at a loss how to act. Then, taking a hand of Deerslayer's, she affectionately recommended to him to borrow her Bible, and to read it while the savages were inflicting their torments. When the other honestly admitted that it exceeded his power to read, she even volunteered to remain with him, and to perform this holy office in person. The offer was gently declined, and Rivenoak being about to join them, Deerslayer requested the girl to leave him, first enjoining her again to tell those in the Ark to have full confidence in his fidelity. Hetty now walked away, and approached the group of females with as much confidence and self-possession as if she were a native of the tribe. On the other hand, the Huron resumed his seat by the side of his prisoner, the one continuing to ask questions with all the wily ingenuity of a practised Indian counsellor, and the other baffling him by the very means that are known to be the most efficacious in defeating the finesse of the more pretending diplomacy of civilization, or by confining his answers to the truth, and the truth only. End of chapter 17. Recording by Bill Borst. Chapter 18 of the Deerslayer. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Deerslayer, by James Fenimore Cooper. Chapter 18. Thus died she. Never more on her shall sorrow light, or shame. She was not made through years or moons the inner weight to bear, which colder hearts endure till they are laid by age in earth. Her days and pleasure were brief but delightful, such as had not stayed long with her destiny. But she sleeps well by the seashore, whereon she loved to dwell. Byron, Don Juan, 4:71. The young men who had been sent out to reconnoitre, on the sudden appearance of Hetty, soon returned to report their want of success in making any discovery. One of them had even been along the beach as far as the spot opposite to the Ark, but the darkness had completely concealed that vessel from his notice. Others had examined in different directions, and everywhere the stillness of night was added to the silence and solitude of the woods. It was consequently believed that the girl had come alone, as on her former visit, and on some similar errand. The Iroquois were ignorant that the Ark had left the castle, and there were movements projected, if not in the course of actual execution, by this time, which also greatly added to the sense of security. A watch was set, therefore, and all but the sentinels disposed themselves to sleep. Sufficient care was had to the safe keeping of the captive, without inflicting on him any unnecessary suffering. And as for Hetty, she was permitted to find a place among the Indian girls in the best manner she could. She did not find the friendly offices of Hist, though her character not only bestowed impunity from pain and captivity, but it procured for her a consideration and an attention that placed her, on the score of comfort, quite on a level with the wild but gentle beings around her. She was supplied with a skin, and made her own bed on a pile of boughs, a little apart from the huts. Here she was soon in a profound sleep, like all around her. There were now 13 men in the party, and 3 kept watch at a time. One remained in shadow, not far from the fire, however. His duty was to guard the captive, to take care that the fire neither blazed up so as to illuminate the spot, nor yet became wholly extinguished, and to keep an eye generally on the state of the camp. Another passed from one beach to the other, crossing the base of the point, while the third kept moving slowly around the strand on its outer extremity, to prevent a repetition of the surprise that had already taken place that night. This arrangement was far from being usual among savages, who ordinarily rely more on the secrecy of their movements than on vigilance of this nature, but it had been called for by the peculiarity of the circumstances in which the Hurons were now placed. Their position was known to their foes, and it could not easily be changed at an hour which demanded rest. Perhaps, too, they placed most of their confidence on the knowledge of what they believed to be passing higher up the lake, and which, it was thought, would fully occupy the whole of the pale-faces who were at liberty, with their solitary Indian ally. It was also probable Rivenoak was aware that, in holding his captive, he had in his own hands the most dangerous of all his enemies. The precision with which those accustomed to watchfulness, or lives of disturbed rest, sleep, is not the least of the phenomena of our mysterious being. The head is no sooner on the pillow than consciousness is lost, and yet, at a necessary hour, the mind appears to arouse the body, as promptly as if it had stood sentinel the while over it. There can be no doubt that they who are thus roused awake, by the influence of thought over matter, though the mode in which this influence is exercised must remain hidden from our curiosity until it shall be explained, should that hour ever arrive, by the entire enlightenment of the soul on the subject of all human mysteries. Thus it was with Hetty Hutter. Feeble as the immaterial portion of her existence was thought to be, it was sufficiently active to cause her to open her eyes at midnight. At that hour she awoke, and leaving her bed of skin and boughs she walked innocently and openly to the embers of the fire, stirring the latter, as the coolness of the night and the woods, in connection with an exceedingly unsophisticated bed, had a little chilled her. As the flame shot up, it lighted the swarthy countenance of the Huron on watch, whose dark eyes glistened under its light like the balls of the panther that is pursued to his den with burning brands. But Hetty felt no fear, and she approached the spot where the Indians stood. Her movements were so natural, and so perfectly devoid of any of the stealthiness of cunning or deception, that he imagined she had merely arisen on account of the coolness of the night, a common occurrence in a bivouac, and the one of all others, perhaps, the least likely to excite suspicion. Hetty spoke to him, but he understood no English. She then gazed near a minute at the sleeping captive, and moved slowly away in a sad and melancholy manner. The girl took no pains to conceal her movements. Any ingenious expedient of this nature quite likely exceeded her powers. Still, her step was habitually light, and scarcely audible. As she took the direction of the extremity of the point, or the place where she had landed in the first adventure, and where Hist had embarked, the sentinel saw her light form gradually disappear in the gloom without uneasiness or changing his own position. He knew that others were on the lookout, and he did not believe that one who had twice come into the camp voluntarily, and had already left it openly, would take refuge in flight. In short, the conduct of the girl excited no more attention than that of any person of feeble intellect would excite in civilized society, while her person met with more consideration and respect. Hetty certainly had no very distinct notions of the localities, but she found her way to the beach, which she reached on the same side of the point as that on which the camp had been made. By following the margin of the water, taking a northern direction, she soon encountered the Indian who paced the strand as sentinel. This was a young warrior, and when he heard her light tread coming along the gravel, he approached swiftly, though with anything but menace in his manner. The darkness was so intense that it was not easy to discover forms within the shadows of the woods at the distance of 20 feet, and quite impossible to distinguish persons until near enough to touch them. The young Huron manifested disappointment when he found whom he had met, for, truth to say, he was expecting his favorite, who had promised to relieve the ennui of a midnight watch with her presence. This man was also ignorant of English, but he was at no loss to understand why the girl should be up at that hour. Such things were usual in an Indian village and camp, where sleep is as irregular as the meals. Then poor Hetty's known imbecility, as in most things connected with the savages, stood her friend on this occasion. Vexed at his disappointment, and impatient of the presence of one he thought an intruder, the young warrior signed for the girl to move forward, holding the direction of the beach. Hetty complied, but as she walked away she spoke aloud in English in her usual soft tones, which the stillness of the night made audible at some little distance. "If you took me for a Huron girl, warrior," she said, "I don't wonder you are so little pleased. I am Hetty Hutter, Thomas Hutter's daughter, and have never met any man at night, for mother always said it was wrong, and modest young women should never do it. Modest young women of the pale faces, I mean, for customs are different in different parts of the world, I know. No, I'm Hetty Hutter, and wouldn't meet even Hurry Harry, though he should fall down on his knees and ask me. Mother said it was wrong." By the time Hetty had said this, she reached the place where the canoes had come ashore, and, owing to the curvature of the land and the bushes, would have been completely hid from the sight of the sentinel, had it been broad day. But another footstep had caught the lover's ear, and he was already nearly beyond the sound of the girl's silvery voice. Still Hetty, bent only on her own thoughts and purposes, continued to speak, though the gentleness of her tones prevented the sounds from penetrating far into the woods. On the water they were more widely diffused. "Here I am, Judith," she added, "and there is no one near me. The Huron on watch has gone to meet his sweetheart, who is an Indian girl, you know, and never had a Christian mother to tell her how wrong it is to meet a man at night." Hetty's voice was hushed by a hist that came from the water, and then she caught a dim view of the canoe, which approached noiselessly, and soon grated on the shingle with its bow. The moment the weight of Hetty was felt in the light craft, the canoe withdrew, stern foremost, as if possessed of life and volition, until it was 100 yards from the shore. Then it turned, and, making a wide sweep, as much to prolong the passage as to get beyond the sound of voices, it held its way towards the ark. For several minutes nothing was uttered, but believing herself to be in a favorable position to confer with her sister, Judith, who alone sat in the stern, managing the canoe with a skill little short of that of a man, began a discourse which she had been burning to commence ever since they had quitted the point. "Here we are safe, Hetty," she said, "and may talk without the fear of being overheard. You must speak low, however, for sounds are heard far on the water in a still night. I was so close to the point some of the time while you were on it, that I have heard the voices of the warriors, and I heard your shoes on the gravel of the beach, even before you spoke." "I don't believe, Judith, the Hurons know I have left them. Quite likely they do not, for a lover makes a poor sentry, unless it be to watch for his sweetheart. But tell me, Hetty, did you see and speak with Deerslayer?" "Oh, yes. There he was seated near the fire, with his legs tied, though they left his arms free to move them as he pleased." "Well, what did he tell you, child? Speak quick, I am dying to know what message he sent me." "What did he tell me? Why, what do you think, Judith? He told me that he couldn't read. Only think of that! A white man, and not know how to read his Bible even. He never could have had a mother, sister." "Never mind that, Hetty. All men can't read. Though mother knew so much and taught us so much, father knows very little about books, and he can barely read the Bible, you know." "Oh! I never thought fathers could read much, but mothers ought all to read, else how can they teach their children?" "Depend on it, Judith, Deerslayer could never have had a mother, else he would know how to read." "Did you tell him I sent you ashore, Hetty, and how much concern I feel for his misfortune?" asked the other, impatiently. "I believe I did, Judith, but you know I am feeble-minded, and I may have forgotten. I did tell him you brought me ashore, and he told me a great deal that I was to say to you, which I remember well, for it made my blood run cold to hear him. He told me to say that his friends— I suppose you are one of them, sister? How can you torment me thus, Hetty? Certainly I am one of the truest friends he has on earth." "Torment you! Yes, now I remember all about it. I am glad you used that word, Judith, for it brings it all back to my mind. Well, he said he might be tormented by the savages, but he would try to bear it as becomes a Christian white man, and that no one need be afeared. Why does Deerslayer call it afeared, when mother always taught us to say afraid?" "Never mind, dear Hetty, never mind that now," cried the other, almost gasping for breath. "Did Deerslayer really tell you that he thought the savages would put him to the torture? Recollect now, well, Hetty, for this is a most awful and serious thing." "Yes, he did, and I remember it by your speaking about my tormenting you." "Oh, I felt very sorry for him, and Deerslayer took all so quietly and without noise. Deerslayer is not as handsome as Hurry Harry, Judith, but he is more quiet." "He's worth 1,000,000 Hurries. Yes, he's worth all the young men who ever came upon the lake put together," said Judith, with an energy and positiveness that caused her sister to wonder. "He is true. There is no lie about Deerslayer. You, Hetty, may not know what a merit it is in a man to have truth, but when you get—no, I hope you will never know it. Why should one like you ever be made to learn the hard lesson to distrust and hate?" Judith bowed her face, dark as it was, and unseen she must have been by any eye but that of omniscience, between her hands, and groaned. This sudden paroxysm of feeling, however, lasted but for a moment, and she continued more calmly, still speaking frankly to her sister, whose intelligence, and whose discretion in anything that related to herself, she did not in the least distrust. Her voice, however, was low and husky, instead of having its former clearness and animation. "It is a hard thing to fear truth, Hetty," she said, "and yet do I more dread Deerslayer's truth than any enemy. One cannot tamper with such truth. So much honesty, such obstinate uprightness. But we are not altogether unequal, sister, Deerslayer and I. He is not altogether my superior." It was not usual for Judith so far to demean herself as to appeal to Hetty's judgment, nor did she often address her by the title of sister, a distinction that is commonly given by the junior to the senior, even where there is perfect equality in all other respects. As trifling departures from habitual deportment oftener strike the imagination than more important changes, Hetty perceived the circumstances, and wondered at them in her own simple way. Her ambition was a little quickened, and the answer was as much out of the usual course of things as the question, the poor girl attempting to refine beyond her strength. "Superior, Judith!" she repeated with pride. "In what can Deerslayer be your superior? Are you not mother's child, and does he know how to read, and wasn't mother before any woman in all this part of the world? I should think, so far from supposing himself your superior, he would hardly believe himself mine. You are handsome, and he is ugly." "No, not ugly, Hetty," interrupted Judith, "only plain, but his honest face has a look in it that is far better than beauty. In my eyes Deerslayer is handsomer than Hurry Harry." "Judith Hutter, you frighten me. Hurry is the handsomest mortal in the world, even handsomer than you are yourself, because a man's good looks, you know, are always better than a woman's good looks." This little innocent touch of natural taste did not please the elder sister at the moment, and she did not scruple to betray it. "Hetty, you now speak foolishly, and had better say no more on this subject," she answered. "Hurry is not the handsomest mortal in the world, by many, and there are officers in the garrisons," Judith stammered at the words, "there are officers in the garrisons near us far comelier than he. But why do you think me the equal of Deerslayer? Speak of that, for I do not like to hear you show so much admiration of a man like Hurry Harry, who has neither feelings, manners, nor conscience. You are too good for him, and he ought to be told it, at once." "I! Judith, how you forget! Why, I am not beautiful, and am feeble-minded." "You are good, Hetty, and that is more than can be said of Harry March. He may have a face and a body, but he has no heart. But enough of this, for the present. Tell me what raises me to an equality with Deerslayer." "To think of you asking me this, Judith! He can't read, and you can. He don't know how to talk, but speaks worse than Hurry, even. For, sister, Harry doesn't always pronounce his words right. Did you ever notice that?" "Certainly, he is as coarse in speech as in everything else. But I fear you flatter me, Hetty, when you think I can be justly called the equal of a man like Deerslayer. It is true, I have been better taught, in one sense am more comely, and perhaps might look higher, but then his truth makes a fearful difference between us. Well, I will talk no more of this, and we will bethink us of the means of getting him out of the hands of the Hurons. We have father's chest in the Ark, Hetty, and might try the temptation of more elephants, though I fear such baubles will not buy the liberty of a man like Deerslayer. I am afraid father and Hurry will not be as willing to ransom Deerslayer as Deerslayer was to ransom them." "Why not, Judith? Hurry and Deerslayer are friends, and friends should always help one another." "Alas, poor Hetty, you little know mankind. Seeming friends are often more to be dreaded than open enemies, particularly by females. But you'll have to land in the morning, and try again what can be done for Deerslayer. Tortured he shall not be, while Judith Hutter lives, and can find means to prevent it." The conversation now grew desultory, and was drawn out, until the elder sister had extracted from the younger every fact that the female faculties of the latter permitted her to retain, and to communicate. When Judith was satisfied, though she could never be said to be satisfied, whose feelings seemed to be so interwoven with all that related to the subject, as to have excited a nearly inappeasable curiosity, but when Judith could think of no more questions to ask, without resorting to repetition, the canoe was paddled towards the scow. The intense darkness of the night, and the deep shadows which the hills and forest cast upon the water, rendered it difficult to find the vessel anchored as it had been as close to the shore as a regard for safety rendered prudent. Judith was expert in the management of a bark canoe, the lightness of which demanded skill rather than strength, and she forced her own little vessel swiftly over the water the moment she had ended her conference with Hetty, and had come to the determination to return. Still no ark was seen. Several times the sisters fancied they saw it looming up in the obscurity like a low, black rock, but on each occasion it was found to be either an optical illusion, or some swell of the foliage on the shore. After a search that lasted half an hour, the girls were forced to the unwelcome conviction that the ark had departed. Most young women would have felt the awkwardness of their situation, in a physical sense, under the circumstances in which the sisters were left, more than any apprehensions of a different nature. Not so with Judith, however, and even Hetty felt more concern about the motives that might have influenced her father and Hurry, than any fears for her own safety. "It cannot be, Hetty," said Judith, when a thorough search had satisfied them both that no ark was to be found. "It cannot be that the Indians have rafted, or swum off and surprised our friends as they slept." "I don't believe that Hist and Chingachgook would sleep until they had told each other all they had to say after so long a separation. Do you, sister?" "Perhaps not, child. There was much to keep them awake, but one Indian may have been surprised even when not asleep, especially as his thoughts may have been on other things. Still, we should have heard a noise, for in a night like this an oath of Hurry Harry's would have echoed in the eastern hills like a clap of thunder." "Hurry is sinful and thoughtless about his words, Judith," Hetty meekly and sorrowfully answered. "No, no, 'tis impossible the ark could be taken, and I not hear the noise. It is not an hour since I left it, and the whole time I have been attentive to the smallest sound, and yet it is not easy to believe a father would willingly abandon his children." "Perhaps father has thought us in our cabin asleep, Judith, and has moved away to go home. You know we often move the ark in the night." "This is true, Hetty, and it must be as you suppose. There is a little more like southern air than there was, and they have gone up the lake." Judith stopped, for as the last word was on her tongue, the scene was suddenly lighted, though only for a single instant, by a flash. The crack of a rifle succeeded, and then followed the roll of the echo along the eastern mountains. Almost at the same moment a piercing female cry arose in the air in a prolonged shriek. The awful stillness that succeeded was, if possible, more appalling than the fierce and sudden interruption of the deep silence of midnight. Resolute as she was both by nature and habit, Judith scarce breathed, while poor Hetty hid her face and trembled. "That was a woman's cry, Hetty," said the former solemnly, "and it was a cry of anguish. If the ark is moved from this spot, it can only have gone north of this air, and the gun and the shriek came from the point. Can anything have befallen Hist? Let us go and see, Judith. She may want our assistance, for besides herself, there are none but men in the ark." It was not a moment for hesitation, and ere Judith had ceased speaking, her paddle was in the water. The distance to the point, in a direct line, was not great, and the impulses under which the girls worked were too exciting to allow them to waste the precious moments in useless precautions. They paddled incautiously for them, but the same excitement kept others from noting their movements. Presently a glare of light caught the eye of Judith through an opening in the bushes, and steering by it, she so directed the canoe as to keep it visible while she got as near the land as was either prudent or necessary. The scene that was now presented to the observation of the girls was within the woods, on the side of the declivity so often mentioned, and in plain view from the boat. Here all in the camp were collected, some 6 or 8 carrying torches of fat pine, which cast a strong but funereal light on all beneath the arches of the forest. With her back supported against a tree, and sustained on one side by the young sentinel whose remissness had suffered Hetty to escape, sat the female whose expected visit had produced his delinquency. By the glare of the torch that was held near her face, it was evident that she was in the agonies of death, while the blood that trickled from her bared bosom betrayed the nature of the injury she had received. The pungent, peculiar smell of gunpowder, too, was still quite perceptible in the heavy, damp night air. There could be no question that she had been shot. Judith understood it all at a glance. The streak of light had appeared on the water a short distance from the point, and either the rifle had been discharged from a canoe hovering near the land, or it had been fired from the ark in passing. An incautious exclamation, or laugh, may have produced the assault, for it was barely possible that the aim had been assisted by any other agent than sound. As to the effect, that was soon still more apparent, the head of the victim dropping, and the body sinking in death. Then all the torches but one were extinguished, a measure of prudence, and the melancholy train that bore the body to the camp was just to be distinguished by the glimmering light that remained. Judith sighed heavily and shuddered, as her paddle again dipped, and the canoe moved cautiously around the point. A sight had afflicted her senses, and now haunted her imagination, that was still harder to be borne than even the untimely fate and passing agony of the deceased girl. She had seen, under the strong glare of all the torches, the erect form of Deerslayer, standing with commiseration, and as she thought with shame depicted on his countenance, near the dying female. He betrayed neither fear nor backwardness himself, but it was apparent by the glances cast at him by the warriors that fierce passions were struggling in their bosoms. All this seemed to be unheeded by the captive, but it remained impressed on the memory of Judith throughout the night. No canoe was met hovering near the point. A stillness and darkness as complete as if the silence of the forest had never been disturbed, or the sun had never shone on that retired region, now reigned on the point, and on the gloomy water, the slumbering woods, and even the murky sky. No more could be done, therefore, than to seek a place of safety, and this was only to be found in the centre of the lake. Paddling in silence to that spot, the canoe was suffered to drift northerly, while the girls sought such repose as their situation and feelings would permit. Chapter 18. Recording by Bill Borst.